switch to 01. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Good. The coffee is strong. I can attest to that. So, I drank some and poured some on myself. So my name is Luis Torres. I'm an associate professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work and associate dean for research and strategic partnerships. And the most fun part of my work is the work that I do with the BTI Institute. So I'm also the thrust lead for international flows of people, particularly on the policy area. And I'm one of the folks on the team that's put this event together. We are still waiting. Some people have gotten some text. There's been a little bit of confusion with parking and, of course, Houston traffic. So there'll be more folks joining us, but I want to go ahead and get us started. So first, I want to welcome you all to Houston, those that are coming from outside, and to this event. We wanted to hold it at the university, but space on campus is at a premium these days. So instead, we picked a fancy hotel up on the 20th floor. So the views are spectacular. You have a chance to look out the windows at some point. It's also very centrally located. And since we had folks coming from outside, we thought it would be nice for folks to actually stay here as well. So this is an event that takes an enormous amount of effort. And tomorrow afternoon, in our closing remarks, we'll thank everybody that's played a role. But it really does take a village to put something like this. I am very, very grateful for the team at the BTI Institute, my colleagues at the broader university in the Division of Research and in the Graduate College of Social Work, and of course for all the wonderful colleagues that I have throughout the country that when I called, shared in the excitement for this event. So thank you so much for being here. This is going to be 2 really fun days of honest and open dialogue. As I've said in many of the emails and you saw in the registration materials, there are no media people here. We did that purposely. We also made the decision not to stream the event live. We wanted, it was a balancing act between reaching more people and really providing for an honest discussion. So over the next 2 days, we're going to hear about the state of knowledge, or state of knowledge and capability in the 4 areas that are in the program, and then engage both afternoons in some really honest conversation about what's working and what's not working and what else do we need. The 4 areas, as you have from your program, I'll come back to the disclaimer in a minute. Back, I gotta go back. Oh yeah, there you go. So these are the 4 areas that we're going to be hearing presentations on today and tomorrow. Strategies to prevent unauthorized flows of people. Keeping a secure and safe border is important, and we have to figure out what's working and what else do we do to make sure that we have a secure border. We have to also think outside the box in terms of what do we do with folks that come here that make it here in an unauthorized fashion. So rethinking this removal and repatriation process and looking at what we may be able to do. There is a lot of conversation about disconnected immigrant youth and risk for radicalization. We typically think about this in the context of terrorism, but it's not just disconnected youth that get engaged in activities that harm society. We know of many of these Central American youth that are coming escaping gang violence, and if we don't handle them in effective ways, they end up disconnecting from family, from school, from society, and they end up in the same gangs that they were trying to flee. So we have to wrap our heads around, and several people in the room are experts in that area. And then finally, a broader kind of conversation about rethinking immigration policies and national security. What is it that we need, and what are the chances that we're going to get it? So we have an exciting program, and as you know, the afternoons are working sessions. The ultimate goal is to come away with a set of polished questions, research questions, answerable questions that we can pursue in a number of ways. I have, the disclaimer. This is an event that's sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security and hosted by us. There are many people who are going to be taking the podium over the next 2 days, and their views are unless stated otherwise, their views. They're not necessarily speaking for the government or for DHS or for their employers, whoever that might be. And individuals will do their own disclaimers as well. A couple of quick announcements before I turn it over to our fearless leader, Dr. Kakadiaris. Wi-Fi, so you have the cards have the correct instructions. They were not the ones that were in your registration, so Microsoft Word thinks it is smarter than everybody else, so it corrects BTI to Bit Institute. But as the saying goes, a rose by any other name, right? Restrooms, when you exit this door, the ladies' room is immediately to your right, and the men's room is to the left. The breakout rooms for the afternoon, we'll announce that after lunch also, but they're also on this floor at the end of the hallway, room 3 to the left and room 4 to the right. I have been asked to let you know that there are some photo video releases for the speakers that are going around. So if you can complete those at your convenience and hand them to Tiffany at the registration desk. And then there's also a crowd photo release. We'll be documenting. There's no media, but we have to provide proof that the event happened. So that'll be some documentation. So that's it for me. I am delighted to turn it over to the director of the Borders, Trade, and Immigration Institute, Dr. Kakadiaris.
Thank you very much, Luis. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the University of Houston and the Borders and Trade Immigration Institute, I too would like to welcome you on this exciting workshop. It's my aspiration that in the next 2 days, I'll meet each and every one of you and learn about what you do and what keeps you up at night. So, as Luis mentioned, I serve as the director of the Borders, Trade, and Immigration Institute. Let me see, where do I have to point? Okay. So, our mission is actually in our name, Borders, Trade, and Immigration. We conduct research and provide educational materials to enhance the nation's ability to secure our borders, to facilitate legitimate trade and travel, and to ensure the integrity of our immigration policies. So we are an alliance of academic and corporate partners. Currently, we have 10 academic partners and 1 corporate partner, and our partners are in 7 states. As a DHS Center of Excellence, established in July 2015, our charter is to reach to any of the 500 universities in the United States to put together the A teams, the teams that will be able to provide the research that you need to address the challenges that we are facing. And I apologize, we have to find the proper mechanism of where to point. Okay, sorry. Okay. All right, future speakers, you have to know where to point. I'll get some support from our staff. Okay, so as Assistant Secretary Bursin says, borders are no longer lines on the sand. They are enabling transnational flows. They are enablers of economic development. And in our research portfolio, right now we have 2 major themes: transnational flows of people, transnational flows of goods, and of course there is an educational component in terms of education and workforce development. So you can remember the 3 letters, PTI, but also I want you to remember transnational flows. And these are examples of the projects that we currently have in our portfolio. And you can see in the area of transnational flows of people, we have projects that look into recidivism, and Dr. Golub is here, who is leading this project. We have projects that work on human smuggling, and Dr. Hale is here, just walked in the room. Look at problems that are modeling the wait times at ports of entry, and also have projects that look at the security and facilitation that is enabled by technologies such as face recognition and biometrics in general. For me, transnational flows encompasses additional concepts encompasses the concept of people, goods, but also culture. So I'm delighted that our friends from the arts community are here, and I want to publicly thank the Deputy Director of the Blaffer Art Gallery, Jim Rosengren. Jim, thank you very much for making the connections with this important segment of our community, and we're looking forward to the introductions. Also, transnational flows of data, and one way to think of this is cybersecurity, cyber resiliency. That's flows of information, correct? And then we have transnational flows of capital, and that's anti-money laundering. They are in red because we don't have any projects currently in our portfolio, but I want you to give you a global view of what is transnational flows for the Institute. So one thing that I wanted to share with you is that the BTI is a multi-sided platform, much like Uber, for example, correct? Uber has two distinct user groups, the drivers and the riders, and they derive economic benefits from sharing in the same network. Similarly, the BTI is a multi-sided platform. It comprises from distinct user groups that derive benefits for being part of the network. We funded by a cooperative agreement, so I feel in my shoulders the burden of providing value to the taxpayer that is funding our work. So our promise to the taxpayer is to bring added value in securing and facilitating transnational flows, of course, ultimately contributing to economic development. To the Office of University Programs that put together the concept of a DHS Center of Excellence, our job is to affect technology and policy transfer. That's one of the issues that differentiates us from other centers of excellence, that policy and policy transfer is central to our mission, and I'll be happy to talk with all of you about this. In terms of the components, and we're delighted to have several DHS components here, our promise to you is to connect you with strong interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary teams and involve you from the project start to transition, okay? And I want to hear your ideas on how we can provide additional value and, of course, address critical workforce development needs that you have. Our promise to the researchers that are part of our alliance is that we offer them mentoring and support so their work will have a real impact in addressing and security and facilitation of transnational flows. And our promise to the students is to provide them an opportunity to become the next generation of experts in that space. So the DHS Center of Excellence on Borders, Trade, and Immigration is actually part of a network that the Office of University Programs has put together to address the challenges that are facing our homeland. And you can see here the areas of the Homeland Security centers, the centers of excellence, and you can see that they are either focused on a specific application domain, like animal disease, or they are focused on scientific methods like data and visual analysis. The next slide, I'll give you an overview of the universities that are leading these centers of excellence. And in addition, we have 6 centers of excellence that are centers emeritus, and Dr. Golub, who is the executive director of the PTI predecessor in that space of the Borders Institute. At this point, I want to echo what Louis said. We're very thankful to the Department of Homeland Security for providing the funding for this workshop. And I would like to invite to the podium our program manager, Mr. Theofilos Gimelas, to address this audience. Thank you very much. Okay, now we know how to turn it off. I apologize.
Thank you, Yanis. So, as you know, I'm with the Science and Technology Director, and that's why I don't use this technology and prepare slides. So I just wanted to take this moment to thank Luis and Yanis for for organizing, in their leadership role in organizing this event, take the initiative to reach out to our customers, and you're going to see a number of senior executives from DHS here, and they reached out to them early to make sure that we have a portfolio on immigration in this center. That's part of their scope of work, is just defined, and to bring together the research community. So, yes, sir. Right here. There you go. Thank you. Glad I saw you. We've done this framework in the past. It's been very, very well received and very successful in terms of the outcomes of trying to figure out what are the knowledge gaps in this space and in the immigration challenges. So, so I want to thank them for doing that, and I look forward to the outcomes of the workshop. And I'll turn it over to our Deputy Assistant Secretary. I think you're next on the agenda.
Thank you, dear. Appreciate it.
I'll just take the mic and I'll be quick. So I'm Mary Giovanoli. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Immigration Policy, and along with our Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Immigration Statistics, Mark Rosenblum, we're here sort of representing the headquarters function of DHS. And I can't tell you how thrilled I am to see everybody here, to see the diversity of issues and ideas and disciplines that Johannes and Luis have brought together. It's amazing. And to me, it's one of the as I was telling somebody over there, I turned into a pumpkin in January because I'm a political appointee, and one of the things that I'm going to carry away with me is this tremendous excitement about the opportunities and the possibilities that exist within DHS through this network of all the centers of excellence, but particularly BTI, to actually be able to engage in a way where the next time we have comprehensive immigration reform, the next time we have various crises at the border or wherever they may be, that we may actually be able to have a series of well thought out, well developed policy initiatives that have really been started, maybe at the academic level, but that have really been generated by the needs and the interests of DHS. And I think in particular, sort of thinking about, immigration 3.0 really, or 2.1 or whatever the right way of saying that would be, is so critical to what we're doing here now. And the challenges and the questions that have been put on the agenda are challenges and questions about what could immigration, a working system, really look like? What could we be doing in the space of removals, in the space of managing flows, in the space of better integrating and approaching immigrants and talking about immigrants and immigration in ways that actually sort of lift up the important contributions that people make on a daily basis and that make our country so much stronger and more resilient and just a better place to be. And so I'm very excited by that. And I'll end with one thing, which was, everybody always says, well, Texas, everything's bigger and better, right? And I'm like, yeah, right. So last night, my friend is driving me in, and I look over the city, and there is the biggest, goldest, roundest harvest moon I have ever seen in my life. And I'm like, well, okay, maybe it's true. And so I thought to myself, that is really a tremendous sign, I think, of what we can accomplish in the next couple of days. This is big, this is bold, it's gold, and I think we can do a lot with it, if not only by having deep and profound conversations, but also by continuing to have those conversations and network going forward. So I'm so excited and really looking forward to the promise of both a harvest moon and all the great work people are going to do here.
So now we'll proceed to the first session, and I'll hand the mic to Luis.
Thank you, Yanis. So in the interest of time, so that we can have as much time as possible to engage in the work that we want to do, we are going to do this the way that academic conferences proceed, which is not spend a lot of time reading people's bios, right? I go to a lot of conferences, and some of them, the reading of the bio takes longer than the presentation itself. So we will dispense with that. The bios are all in your program, following the two-day agenda. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark Rosenblum, who's our first speaker, Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Immigration Statistics in the Department of Homeland Security. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. So I'm good without that, I think. Thank you very much for having me. Those are such nice introductory comments. It feels a little intimidating to follow on that. But I'll just say that not only is everything bigger and better in Texas, but Houston is also my hometown, so I'm very happy to be home. I grew up about 1.5 miles from here. Thank you for the opportunity to come back and join y'all. I want to, what I'll cover today is I want to talk about our efforts to do a better job of measuring immigration enforcement, both at the border and within the United States. The challenge of measuring it and what we know about what we're doing at the border and on interior enforcement. So the challenge is obviously that it's difficult to measure illicit stocks and flows because unauthorized immigrants don't want to be counted. So we have a very good idea about how many people we apprehend and how many people we deport, but we don't know about the denominator, what share of apprehension, what share of unauthorized crossers, what share of unauthorized immigrants do we successfully do enforcement against. To put it into a little bit of a framework for thinking about what we know and what we don't know, there are 4 different types of things that we're interested in measuring when it comes to enforcement. Our inputs describe what we do to enforce immigration policy, how many agents, things like that. And then policies are also a very important aspect of how we do immigration enforcement. And I'll organize a lot of my comments around how policy shifts in the US and at the border have shaped the enforcement regime. And then in terms of looking at how enforcement works, we can distinguish between enforcement outputs, which is sort of the immediate impacts of enforcement. So for example, how hard is it to cross the border unlawfully? And how hard is it to remain in the US unlawfully, to live and work in the US unlawfully, or how easy is it for us to find and apprehend people within the US? And then really the ultimate enforcement outcomes are how many people successfully cross the border, how many unauthorized immigrants are in the US. So if we're trying to evaluate immigration enforcement, those are really the 2 numbers, or the 2 sets of numbers that we should care most about, is those outcomes, those ultimate outcomes. Those are the things that we're interested in measuring. And then what kind of tools, what kind of data sources do we have available to do the measuring? And I've listed sort of 4 main types of data that we have access to. Administrative data, things that the government does. We have very reliable measures of what we do. We know exactly how many people we apprehend. Those tend to not be highly valid indicators of the outputs and the outcomes we're interested in, right? Like knowing how many people we apprehend doesn't tell us how many people we don't apprehend. And then subject matter expert assessments, those tend to do a better job of getting at the real concepts we're interested in, but they're less reliable because they rely on subjective judgment or some, hopefully we have a methodology behind them, but it's still not going to be as reliable of a methodology as counting things like apprehensions. Survey data also can be generally pretty valid because we can ask unauthorized immigrants very specific questions about their experience that should relate very closely to the kinds of things we're interested in. Were you apprehended when you tried to cross the border? How many times were you apprehended? How many times did you cross successfully? And there's a lot of academic research that evaluates how reliable those surveys are. You have to get a good sample, but generally, at least the academics tell us that unauthorized immigrants are pretty open about describing their experiences accurately. And then DHS is currently involved in efforts to use mathematical models to help, to draw on these other data sources to come up with sort of more insightful ways to get right at the concepts that we're interested in. And because these tools are in development, I'm not going to be able to give you like totally concrete answers of what they show us because we're still working on them. And we also, one of the reasons we're still working on them is to figure out exactly how reliable they are, at least to put confidence intervals around them so that we can describe what we know about them. So what I'll do with the rest of my talk is I'm just going to sort of walk through those 3 or 4 types of metrics, or 4 types of metrics. I'm going to group them into 3 parts of my presentation. First, talking about the border, then talking about interior, and then I'll conclude with some sort of big picture thoughts. All right, so I'm going to organize the discussion of what we do at the border in terms of 3 turning points in our border enforcement policies. Prior to 1993, we didn't really have sort of an overarching strategy for border enforcement. The Border Patrol published its first national strategy on border enforcement in 1993. And basically what that strategy said was, whereas historically Border Patrol had operated sort of throughout the U.S. and done a lot of its work in immigrant communities, in cities, beginning in 1993, they adopted an explicit strategy that they called prevention through deterrence. And what that focused on was concentrating a lot of resources on the, right at the border in order to make it harder for people to cross and to discourage them from even trying to cross. So one of the things that you saw as prevention through deterrence was rolled out is a big increase in spending at the border. So you can see this line just shows total spending on border enforcement over the last 35 years. You can see that there was a little inflection point around 1986 with the passage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of that year. You see a steeper inflection point in the mid-90s as this prevention through deterrence strategy was unrolled. You see spending tick up at a sharper rate than it had historically. And then you also, of course, see a steeper inflection point after 9/11. So one bottom line from this picture is that consistent with this effort to make it harder to cross the border, we've concentrated more resources on spending at the border. And more generally, that there has been this huge increase in resources targeting border enforcement over the last 35 years. So it has been a real priority for the U.S. government. Then a second sort of policy turning point in how we approach border enforcement came in 2005 as part of the Secure Border Initiative. And the idea here was to end catch and release. And what that refers to is that historically, a large share of people apprehended at the border were processed through, they were apprehended and put into the DHS data system, but basically given a court date and said, come back in a year or 2 years or 3 or 4 years, and we'll hold your hearing then. There was a policy decision made in 2005 that in the vast majority of cases, we would hold people in immigrant detention until their cases could be, disposed of, until they could either be deported or found, eligible for some form of relief. The point I want to make with this slide is that as a result, contributing to that policy, and as a result of that policy, we have made substantial additional investments in detention space, because you can't commit to holding people, until their cases are resolved without having adequate detention beds. So here you see that, the policy decision goes, that we can see it being implemented in the downstream effect of needing to have those beds. And this policy, was largely what was successfully implemented within a year or two of the announcement. DHS continues, by and large, to hold people unless there's sort of a reason that they shouldn't be held or they're put into an alternative to detention program. But this was a real shift in our approach to border apprehensions, the decision that we were going to, by keeping people in detention, it sped up their processing and made it much more likely that if somebody was found to be removable, that removal order would be executed. So this was, a significant change in the approach to border enforcement in the mid-2000s. And then an additional change that started actually around the same time and was formalized in 2011 was consequence delivery system, and more generally the use of variable consequences to further discourage illegal entries and illegal reentries. And the point here is that historically, the vast majority of people apprehended at the border were deported with no additional consequences. They were subject to voluntary return, which means, in the case of Mexican immigrants in particular, they were put on a bus and sent home, and that was it. They weren't subject to additional restrictions on their ability to get a visa in the future. They weren't subject to criminal charges. Beginning in the mid-2000s and more formally after 2011, there was an effort to use a range of more severe consequences, including subjecting people to criminal charges, either through Operation Streamline or through traditional prosecutions for the federal crime of illegal entry or illegal reentry. And then at a lower level, a lower consequence, subjecting people to formal removal instead of voluntary return. And the difference between formal removal and voluntary return is that with formal removal, you go through a process before an administrative judge, either directly before a judge or DHS acting on the judge's behalf, essentially. And if you're found formally removable, you become ineligible to get a visa to come back to the U.S. You're subject to criminal charges if you're apprehended in the future in the U.S. So it's a more formal and more punitive enforcement consequence than simply being put on a bus. So this picture actually just shows a subset of the impacts of that. What this picture is showing you is of all CBP enforcement actions, so including both Border Patrol and the Office of Field Operations, for people who were deported, for people who were apprehended by either of those agencies, so found inadmissible or apprehended by Border Patrol. No, I'm sorry, these are just apprehensions, but the removals and returns, actually now I'm looking at this, I'm realizing I'm showing you some apples and oranges here. So ignore the line, just look at the bars. So because the bars are showing both OFO and CBP, how many people were formally removed and how many people were allowed to have voluntary return. And what you see is that historically, and this is really just recent history, if you go back in history, it's a much more unbalanced ratio. The vast majority of people were allowed to have voluntary return. CBP has gradually all but eliminated voluntary return. Almost all of the voluntary returns that are left in this figure are OFO returns. So it's basically people who are allowed to withdraw their application for admission. They're not people who are apprehended, and deported, and replaced the vast majority of those voluntary returns with formal removals. So, what you can see in the data is that this policy of more severe consequences, and the other thing that CDS, the consequence delivery system, does is to sort of strategically allocate consequences based on an individual's history. So somebody who has been apprehended multiple times is subject to a more severe consequence than a first-time crosser. Somebody who's previously been convicted of a crime is subject to a more severe consequence than someone who hasn't been convicted of a crime. So it's sort of systematically doling out those tougher consequences to deter further illegal behavior, including further illegal entries. And you can see that in the wake of the policy, that the data show that policy has been implemented. So those are the kinds of things that CBP has done sort of to make enforcement more robust at the border, more resources, more detentions, tougher consequences. How do we see that translate into enforcement outputs and enforcement outcomes? I'm going to talk about 4 different things that we can measure that are indicative of enforcement output. So indicative of how hard is it to cross the border illegally successfully. And the first thing I'll show you is border crossing costs. Border crossing costs, so what this refers to is how much do unauthorized immigrants pay to border smugglers on average. This picture is showing you 5 different surveys that ask immigrants, did you hire a smuggler? How much did you pay? These are in real dollars, so those are real, increases over time. I think this is really one of the best indicators we have of enforcement output, and the reason is it's a very, valid market-based indicator of how hard is it to cross the border. And the reason I say that, 2 things. One is that smugglers can only charge what the market will bear. They can't arbitrarily raise their rates because it's a totally deregulated market and they'll get undercut. So if we see this number going up, it's because people are having a harder time crossing and willing to pay more to do it. Immigrants aren't required to hire a smuggler, although we know from other survey data that the vast majority, upwards of 90–95%, do hire smugglers now, although that number's gone up over this time period. So if we see that number going up, it's a very direct indicator of the dependence, the value that smugglers offer, the ability to get across the border, increasing over time. It's also, in addition to being an indicator of it being harder to cross the border, it's a driver of successful enforcement in the sense that as this number goes up, a larger share of immigrants get priced out of the market. So this is both an indicator of the border being more difficult to cross and a driver of fewer illegal crossing attempts. So a second output that we can look at is after people are apprehended, how likely is it that they will make a further attempt? When I went to graduate school in San Diego in the 1990s, I spent a lot of time doing interviews with immigrants, including a lot of unauthorized immigrants in San Diego County, and a large share of them had been apprehended, and essentially everyone who was apprehended re-entered. The next day or 2 days later, if you talk to Border Patrol agents who worked in the 80s and 90s, during the really high flow period, all of them describe, this revolving door of enforcement where they would catch the exact same person day after day after day. So, in that scenario where people are willing to cross 5, 10, 20 times, if we catch 95% of them, it still has no effect on the flow because they get in on the 20th try. So the ability of CBP to, in some ways, to convince people after they've been apprehended to give up and go home is a hugely important indicator of a hugely important successful enforcement output. So this is one way that we can try to get at the idea of deterrence is what share of apprehensions are repeat apprehensions. So this is administrative data, so it's highly reliable. It's not a perfect indicator of deterrence because there's a lot of reasons we might not be seeing them again. They may get in successfully the second time. But we see that according to this metric, this number has been trending down. It trends down sharper in exactly the same period that DHS, CBP was increasing its enforcement consequences through the consequence delivery system. This is probably a more valid indicator. It's survey data asking unauthorized immigrants this is a survey that's conducted among deportees right on the Mexican side of the border. Are you going back in the next week? And that question has been asked for 25 years. And what we saw is that, for most, and this is just a 1 week deterrence question. So it's not, will you ever go back? Or will you go back in the next month or the next 90 days? But for most of the period that this survey has been asked, first of all, we saw that number went down during the 90s and early 2000s when during this period that it was becoming somewhat more difficult to cross. But you see, a very clear turning point in about 2006, 2007, right at the time that DHS, that we saw, a big increase in resources defensing and a steeper increase around 2010, 2011, right at the time that we have begun incarcerating people, criminal charges, more formal removals instead of voluntary returns. The number during the last decade has increased from about 20% saying, no, I'm gonna give up, or I'm not gonna try again in the next week, to 80% saying I'm not gonna try again in the next week. I mean, this is like the biggest, this to me is among the most significant indicators of a successful policy intervention that is radically transforming how unauthorized immigrants operate at the border. There are lots of complex policy issues around the policy of detaining immigrants, incarcerating immigrants, charging them with criminal charges for crossing the border. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm enthusiastically all in for that, but it clearly appears to be having a significant impact on what we see in terms of unauthorized immigration at the border. And again, with the same apprehension rate and fourfold increase in the deterrence rate, we see a massive difference in the number of people ultimately entering the United States. Okay, so a third enforcement output we can look at is this is a statistic that Border Patrol has been reporting for the last few years that they call the interdiction effectiveness rate. And this is based on, gone or left? Oh my goodness, all right. So this is the ratio of total, this is the ratio of apprehensions and turnbacks, people who give up and go home, to apprehensions, turnbacks, and gotaways based on sort of agent estimates. You can see it's trended up slightly. I'm gonna speed up my presentation because I'm taking longer than I budgeted. That interdiction effectiveness rate is sort of a broad measure of how, the share of immigrants who don't succeed in crossing the border. We can also try to calculate an apprehension rate, and this is a narrower concept. It's just looking at the share of border crossers, intending border crossers, who get apprehended, taken into custody, not looking at turnbacks. And that can also be measured a number of ways. We can ask Border Patrol agents to estimate what share do they think they catch. It's a question that we can get at directly through survey data. The last time you tried, were you caught, and how many people say yes and how many people say no. And DHS is working on a mathematical model that relies on a variety of data sources to try to calculate this sort of statistically. And basically, the way this model works is that every time that CBP apprehends somebody, we take their fingerprints. So what this mathematical approach does is it focuses on the people who have been deported to Mexico. And of that population, if they try again, we can see what share of the people who try again do we catch, because we've got their fingerprints. So of all of the re-entry attempts, the number of recidivists tells us what share, gives us an apprehension rate. In order to do that calculation, two things. One is that we have to restrict the analysis to people who have been deported to Mexico. So we're not going to look at asylum seekers who remain in the U.S. in a proceeding, or people who are serving a criminal sentence. We're also not going to look at people who are deported to countries other than Mexico, because they're not going to immediately retry. So we can only do this analysis on a subset of border crossers. And the other thing is that we have to control for the people who give up and go home, which is a number we think is increasing. Because if we, the people we don't catch, we either don't catch them because they went home or because they successfully re-entered. And so this model depends on our ability to accurately estimate what share go home. And then we can look at the difference between those we apprehend and those who successfully re-enter. So this is something that we're actively working on to try to come up with that estimate through this data-driven estimate. All right, so in terms of then the ultimate outcomes, what we care about is the total number of attempts, and especially the total number of unauthorized entries. So did I skip a slide here? Yeah. So traditionally, the way we've gotten to this is by looking at the total number of apprehensions. This is administrative data. We know exactly how many people we apprehend. We have for decades used this as a proxy indicator of the total number of attempts. We assume when this number is going down, it's because fewer people are trying. And if the apprehension rate is constant over time, then that's a perfectly valid assumption. If we are always catching 50% of the border crossers, then if the number of apprehensions goes down by half, that means that the number of attempts went down by half. Again, the problem is that if the apprehension rate is changing over time, then the relationship between apprehensions and attempts and successful entries is also changing over time. So another way that we measure the estimated number of illegal entries is through CBP agents estimating, well, how many people did I see but not apprehend? So they can do an agent estimate of gotaways. I have a placeholder slide here. CBP is increasingly able to do surveillance on larger and larger shares of the border, and we're learning from CBP exactly how they estimate a total number of gotaways based on their surveillance data. And then we can also calculate this number mathematically based on our estimate of the apprehension rate. It's very simple. If we know what the apprehension rate is, and we know how many apprehensions there are, to calculate how many successful illegal entries there were. Even without knowing an apprehension rate, I can tell you that CBP apprehensions fell about 80% between 2000 and 2015. So again, if the apprehension rate was constant during that period, we know that illegal entries also fell 80%. In fact, the actual drop almost certainly exceeds 80% for two reasons. One is that it seems very likely that the apprehension rate has increased, at least somewhat, since 2000 with all of these additional resources that we put into the border. And our preliminary research suggests that it has increased. So even a modest increase in the apprehension rate results in a pretty big drop in illegal entries, relative to the number of apprehensions. So if we apprehended 400,000 people at a 50% apprehension rate, that equates, with a 50% apprehension rate, 400,000 apprehensions means 400,000 people entered illegally. If the apprehension rate is 60%, then 400,000 apprehensions means only 267,000 people entered illegally. So a small increase in the apprehension rate has a big impact on the ratio between apprehensions and illegal entries. But the other reason that the actual number of illegal entries has changed even more dramatically than that big drop in apprehensions suggests is that a much larger share of apprehensions are non-traditional in the sense that they include a large number of generally humanitarian migrants, people who are seeking asylum, unaccompanied children, family units, Cubans. So regardless of what you think about their humanitarian claims, none of that group seek to evade detection as carefully as traditional single adults who are, labor, employment-based immigrants. So the 40% or so of non-traditional immigrants, roughly 100% of them get apprehended. So that means that, the calculation that we need to do to estimate the number of illegal entries, none of these people are successful gotaways. They're all entering the DHS enforcement system and then awaiting an adjudication. So the actual number of successful illegal entries, this whole 40% of the apprehension population gets taken off the top from that. So we've had dramatic changes in our estimate of the successful illegal entries. So being now almost out of time and halfway through my slides, I'm going to quickly tell you that we've seen also significant changes in interior enforcement. One change, 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act made it illegal to knowingly hire an unauthorized immigrant. The point I want you to take from this picture, 2 points. One is that lots of variation over time in how those provisions were enforced during the Bush administration. During the 8 years of the Bush administration, we saw a total of about 500 cases brought against employers for knowingly hiring an unauthorized immigrant out of about 7 or 8 million estimated unauthorized workers and tens of millions of hiring actions. So DHS has always exercised a lot of discretion over where and how to enforce interior enforcement policies. Let's see. All right, so a second big policy change, the 1996 Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, made it much easier to formally remove people instead of voluntary returns. What this picture shows you, and this is research that I did with Faye Hipsman and others at MPI, is that the implementation of IRA radically changed how we do deportations. This is the picture I really want to show you. So this is looking at interior apprehensions, so apprehensions by agencies other than CBP, going back over 40 years, 45 years. Here too you can see a lot of variation over time that DHS and its predecessor INS differently allocated resources to interior enforcement, and you see like between the time that Carter first proposed what eventually became IRCA, and when Reagan passed it, you saw a steady decrease in interior apprehensions. After IRCA passed, you see an increase. But obviously, the huge thing that jumps out on this picture is the impact of IDEN-IAFIS information sharing, which is the technology that underlies Secure Communities, now the Priority Enforcement Program. This unprecedented increase in our ability to identify and apprehend people within the US. I mean, this is like the steepest change you'll ever see in social science data. And it is 100% driven by the availability of that new technology. So when people talk about Secure Communities, PEP, as being a force multiplier, a game changer, it is. And then the other striking thing that you see in this picture is that when the Obama administration maintained those policies during its first term, and very clearly, as the Morton and then Johnson enforcement priorities were implemented, you see an equally dramatic reversal of those policies as enforcement has focused more narrowly on people who fall within the priorities. So this is apprehensions, it's not removals, but especially with interior, there's a pretty close correspondence between the people ICE chooses to take custody of and the people who get put in removal proceedings and ultimately deported. So a very dramatic indicator that, that those priorities are having an impact. This is another indicator that the priorities are having an impact. We see an increasing, decreasing number of ICE removals, increasing share have been convicted of crimes. Same thing. I'm going to give you a sneak preview of our estimate of the unauthorized population in the US, which is the number that we really care about. Like other organizations that are estimating this number, we find that there was steady increase between 2007 and, between 2000 and 2007, about 6% a year, and it's flattened off or declined since then. The other thing that we see in our data is that in 2014, 95% of unauthorized immigrants who are resident in the US have been here more than 5 years, and 75% more than 10 years, which is up from 20% who had been here more than 5 years in 2007. So, what that data point tells you is either that many fewer people are coming in recent years, or that many more recent arrivals are being deported. And either of those are success stories from an enforcement perspective. We've either essentially stopped new illegal inflows or successfully apprehended and deported new illegal unauthorized immigrants. So takeaway observations: at the border, strong evidence that it's more difficult than ever to cross illegally, that we're seeing this radical drop in the number of illegal arrivals, illegal crossings. In particular, the traditional challenge of employment-based single Mexican men or adults, that problem is essentially solved or all but solved. And these new flows that are now 40% of all apprehensions, the takeaway point there is that most of them are presenting themselves to a Border Patrol agent and seeking relief. So building additional fencing or apprehending a higher share of crossers is not a policy solution to address that. They're already being apprehended. The issue is, how do we reduce demand for asylum, for humanitarian flows by addressing the root causes? And how do we adjudicate those cases more efficiently and address the downstream impact on the enforcement system? And then on the interior, it's equally apparent that policies that we've been put in place we have a substantially greater ability to identify and apprehend unauthorized immigrants in the US, that DHS and its predecessor have always exercised a lot of discretion. You see a lot of variation over time in how those policies are enforced. But with 95% of unauthorized immigrants having been here for more than 5 years and 75% having been here for more than 10 years, as we look towards the next administration, what those figures show you is two things. One is that the next president, the next secretary of DHS, if he or she chooses to, certainly has the capacity to identify and deport substantially more unauthorized immigrants from within the U.S. I mean, I think that there has been a lot of skepticism expressed on the left about our ability to sort of solve this problem through enforcement, and it would be expensive, and it would have a huge impact on employers and immigrant communities, but we have a pretty good ability to identify and deport immigrants from within the U.S. and I haven't even talked about, sort of the state level policies that impact quality of life and probably cause some self-deportations. But if the next president chooses to continue the policy of focusing on recent border crossers and criminals, there's just not very many of either of those groups. And we will not, there's the reason that the numbers have fallen, the number of removals has fallen so dramatically in the last few years is that there's not, if you're focusing only on recent crossers and people who've been convicted of serious crimes, you're not going to get that 11 or 12 million number down very much farther because there's just very few people who fall in that category. So, it's how the next administration chooses to use its resources in interior enforcement will have a huge impact on what future pattern we see. And I should have said at the beginning, echoing Luis, that these are definitely my views, not DHS views.
Thank you, Mark. So after Andrew's presentation, we'll go to Q&A for both of them. So next, we have 03 on the slides. Andrew Lorenzen-Straight is Deputy Assistant Director of Custody Programs Division, Enforcement and Removal Operations at U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the Department of Homeland Security. And this is the, looks like a Star Trek phaser.
All right.
It's the right arrow.
Good. You never want to go after the stats guy because you never sound as smart, but thanks, Mark, for those. It's actually very comprehensive and actually can feed off some of that. So I want to, obviously, just a little bit about where I'm from work-wise. ICE is a component of Homeland Security. As Mark alluded to, we're in charge of interior enforcement versus the Border Patrol. I think you're aware of that. And I work for the immigration enforcement side of the house. Before we get into the presentation, let me give you a little about my background and what I bring to the table. I'm the only member of the senior team at ICE that isn't a law enforcement officer. My background is in child dependency, child advocacy. So my career mainly has been spent looking at child neglect and child dependency work. I did legal aid for numerous years. And so I understood that there could be different lenses by which we can do enforcement. And so it's very important as I talk about one of these programs we're doing that I believe that we're adding to our buckets of tools. All right, so the tool that I want to talk about today is family case management. I think Mark was very good at alluding to the whole system and what our priorities are and why ICE in particular does what it does. Our mission is to ensure public safety, but the process is efficient and effective. And that process means whether it goes through the due process of return, removal, or relief, right? We want to ensure compliance with the law, that people are going through it effectively, that we can make sure that there is safe communities, etc. I believed as well that there could be other ways by which we do enforcement. We've obviously talked about with Mark border agents and ICE officers. There's obviously detention as a means for which enforcement can be done. But we never tested comprehensively holistic case management. And the reason I alluded to my background is when I was in family law, child dependency, the biggest compliance factor for me in order to get a parent to do what they needed to do with their court orders or to get someone to comply was a case manager or a social worker. And the biggest thing you could do to drive compliance, and you're seeing this a little bit in criminal justice, was good human-to-human rapport and trust. And case management as a compliance tool has been used all over the globe with refugees, with other undocumented foreign-born persons in Europe and other places. And for many years, those actors were coming to ICE saying, could you test kind of holistic case management as a tool for enforcement? And so a little history about family and case management before we get into it. It first started off as a pilot for adults out of immigration detention centers back in 2013 and 2014. ICE leadership decided to say yes to working on an alternative to detention program that released adults from immigration detention centers to faith-based nonprofits, the Catholics and the Lutherans. These were released in their care, and it was up to them to get them to court, to show up to the ICE check-ins, and if so ordered to be removed, help get them on the plane. This was a small pilot of 100 persons in 2013, 2014, but the data was pretty significant. What changed, and I think Mark's slides show this, is, and he alluded to the kind of non-traditional immigrants, is the rush of families and unaccompanied minors. And so one means by which we encountered that problem or that issue is building up family processing centers or family detention, which was very controversial at the time. And so a lot of the stakeholders were asking, can there be another alternative for these kind of non-traditional actors? And so what I did is raise our hand at ICE and say, yes, we have a proposal to do family case management, meaning testing just the kind of adherence with a kind of a case management model as a sole driver of compliance. And so in 2015, we put together a request for a proposal. In 2016, it was awarded, and we launched, as this what I call phase 2, the Family Case Management Program. What is family case management? You have in front of you probably a paper that looks like this. It's your one-page takeaway of today for my talk. It really is looking at monitoring, access, and orientation as the 3 pillars to ensure comprehensive case management. And what's unique about this? Well, ICE has done case management before with its ISAP program. We've done it in conjunction with GPS monitoring technology. Obviously, it's a kind of a stalwart of the whole probation parole system to have someone guiding you through the system. But there's some unique things that we did here that I think are producing some good results. One is we had dedicated officers assigned to this new program. Now that's key because right now our dockets with our officers are immense. We have on the non-detained side about 1 officer to about 2,000 participants or 2,000 undocumented foreign-born persons going through the process. Our program had 1 officer for about 200 families. And they're dedicated officers in this program. So they're trained, they're qualified, and they're put just working in these equities with these families. Second, we wanted to hire qualified and trained case managers. These people were going to work with the officer in a symbiotic team to be system navigators, to allow them to appreciate to the client, to the family, what their obligations were. We made sure that they did it in a language they can understand. We had a very much a whole push on language and cultural orientation. A third kind of pillar that's interesting is we gave for the first time at ICE funding for Know Your Rights presentations and for a system that made sure that they got access and secured an attorney. Now, never before had ICE done that. The Justice Department had done that before in terms of getting access to Know Your Rights presentations in detention, but this is the first time I said it might be a tool for us to actually get people access to legal counsel and to know their rights, and also access to community services. The whole theory was they will be more effective and efficient actors going through the system if their families and they have trauma issues, they have disability, mental health, medical. If we tune to those issues, they're more likely to produce outcomes of complying with their obligations under federal law. That was the whole theory. That's the whole theory with social work principles. And lo and behold, we found that to be somewhat true. I guess it's only been 10 months. Where is our program? Our program is active in 5 sites. Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, DC, Baltimore, which is a super region, and then New York, Newark. It's small. It's about for 800 families initially, which roughly equates to about 160 families now. The program, again, started in January 21st. We have a good relationship with our primary provider, which also contracted with community-based organizations. It was very, very important for us to actually have community-based organizations work with us. Again, as I mentioned, holistic case management serves to promote compliance, develop rapport, facilitate access. So as the families get processed in, and we'll go over that in a minute, they are already tuned up to ensuring that they have access to their case manager all the times, that they understand who their officer is, and that we look at their particular vulnerabilities to ensure that they are non-flight risk. I'll go back. All right. We have the primary provider is GeoCare, which is our kind of umbrella provider who provides the kind of management structure. They have a lot of their staff doing the work as well as subcontracting with community-based organizations. Those include Bethany Christian Service, the Frida Kahlo Institute in Chicago, International Institute of LA, and Youth Co-op in Miami, and Catholic Charities in New York. The thought was these are already known actors and stakeholders in the community that the trust would already been built up, at least with the surrounding parents, family members, et cetera, working with our primary provider. We also did subcontracts to allow for Know Your Rights presentations to be done, as I mentioned before. Approximately 50% of the cases will go to our primary provider, GeoCare, and 50% will go to our community providers. Go back. So who is our typical participant? Majority of our clients' families are from Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. It's a woman, approximately 28 to 30 years old, a couple children, and likely needs medical care and legal assistance. This shows you our program. Again, this is roughly the 1,100 participants, or about 512 families, where they come from. Again, mostly from the Central American region, which is typical for that migration. And the households are distributed. Chicago is a little different. Chicago, when we initially did some statistics, looked like a city of destination, but it's changed since then. And in order to increase our numbers there, we've actually started enrolling single females, some out of detention and some on the non-detained docket. And so Chicago is a little bit of a different of a contract, but it's one we're still pursuing there. This shows you what types of vulnerabilities we have: pregnant, nursing, young children, trauma, which is the vast majority of them, some victims of domestic violence. This shows you the stage at which they are in their legal proceedings, pre-order or post-order. We are enrolling people that are on post-order, meaning they've had a final order, most likely issued in absentia, and those that are pre-order, and I'll go over the enrollment process. We've found most of our success, though, in the pre-order stage, principally because in the post-order stage, they haven't developed this rapport with their case manager, with this apparatus of support. They're coming in from being in the country for months, if not years, and so the suite of services that we're offering, they don't need. One big part of the plan we're doing is departure planning, which is kind of phase 3, and I'll talk about that in a second. Again, we have qualified case managers that deliver the service. We ensure that there's immediate notification to ICE with any kind of special incident, emergency report, et cetera. And so these three actors, the family, the ICE officer, and the case manager, are all moving together. Again, the mission and aim is to ensure compliance with federal law, but by tuning to their particular needs, they're doing that, which I found to be the case when I worked in the kind of social dependency world, that if you kind of build this trust, especially with this population who felt very strongly about why they came here in the country to the first place, that if they felt they had the bite at the apple, that they had the ability to participate in the due process, they're more likely to kind of take that outcome of the due process. So if they're ordered removed, or if they go through a Know Your Rights presentation and we have said this is likely the outcome relief, it's very narrow, they may decide to return. And we've had several of those cases where they felt the actors built trust, that they understood the system, that it was likely an outcome that wasn't going to be positive, and they, on their own volition, went back. And so I think that is a big, big takeaway from our first 10 months of the program. All right, go back. All right, so primary matrix of compliance. Obviously for us, 100% attendance at courts, 100% check-ins with ICE. We want to ensure people understand their obligations, but that's typical, right? You want to make sure people show up to the ICE check-in, that they get to court, get to the plane. That's a normal matrix for ICE. What for us drives this primary matrix, which are kind of status quo, is the secondary matrix, which is how did getting them access to the food bank or finding them stable housing lead to them complying with their obligations under law. And what we've seen is folks, who have an issue, small children, they're worried about the health care of their small child or themselves. Human nature says they're going to tune to that need first. That, yes, they want to comply, but I got to ensure that, Johnny gets taken care of and that I figure out a way to deal with my cancer treatment. And what we've seen is that when we do that, when we tend to their mental health or medical need, when we get them stable housing, when we get them volunteer community liaisons, that they end up complying just as much, if not more, with what they need to do with regards to federal immigration compliance. And one of the strangest things I've seen is the rapport with the officers is very, very good. In fact, when I've gone on these visits, the first person they greet with open arms is their ICE immigration enforcement officer, because they feel they can trust him. They feel like he's given them a straight answer. And that has been one of the most interesting side effects of this. It wasn't an intended consequence to actually put a dedicated officer on the program. It just was how it worked out in terms of, well, local field staff did not want to give to my program, their staff. And so I had to get positions, which was, I thought, something, hard to surmount, but we ended up doing it as a kind of a collateral that we didn't realize how good that would lend to the compliance. That by ensuring that the officers were well trained and had the ability to speak compassionately and understood their trauma, that led to, and we don't know yet, but again, it's only been 10 months, what exactly is causing the outcomes. But that dedicated officer has certainly been much more value added than I ever anticipated. So again, secondary matrix, making sure they have access to community resources, et cetera. So a typical story is tuning to a medical mental health need. I'm not going to talk about this one in Los Angeles, but this one we just had in Chicago. A mother came in and was coming to the United States to be with part of her family, which is very typical, and she just couldn't get the treatment program she needed for her cancer back in Central America. Our program worked with an area hospital that has a funding stream that allows immigrants to get funding for cancer treatments. She went successfully through that cancer treatment. At the end of the cancer treatment, she's in remission. She elects to return back to Honduras. And so positive outcome there. And in my remaining time, I want to talk a little bit about, well, this is our screening enrollment process. I'm going to flip through this program. So this tells you a little about our screening enrollment, case management, and monitoring. But phase 3 of this, and this is why I'm really interested to talk to you guys, is the return process. And what I think should be more of a focus, and I think Mark did a good job about, enforcement-minded tactics to drive adherence to the law. I think there's a need for that, don't get me wrong. I think you have to do that in some instances. I think our prioritization at looking at criminal actors, the criminal justice system, is a good one. I think, though, for us to think about shifting this problem and addressing it from a global perspective, you have to look at with return with an aim towards reintegration. And so this is phase 3 of our program, which is working with the families going back and as an inducement to return, connecting them with in-country resources of country of origin. So this is back in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, as a means by which if they feel they have to go back, either because they don't feel it's going to work out or they're ordered to go back, we start that planning months in advance. And there is an ability for when they get back to feel, okay, I can root back here. Because most of our families had no intention of going back, may have sold a family farm or the house. And so to go back is a huge psychological and physical barrier. But if to do this in a way where we connect them, maybe in a different part of the country with some civil society actors, we can cut down on remigration and actually help in a couple ways because, friends tell friends, and if they come back, it has the ability to kind of be the next generation of enforcement through a lens of reintegration. This is still in concept form for us. We have had several returns where we have made the connections. We want to do this more formally, and so we are trying to see if we can do it more formally in this contractual relationship we have with our providers, or if it needs a next generation contractual environment. But this is what we feel will be the biggest value added of family case management is looking at it not just domestically but internationally, and in connecting not only the local community resources but to community resources back in the host country or country of origin. So that's where we are now. We are continuing to explore those options as a way to kind of look at this next generation. So again, if you have ideas on this, I am very much interested. We do departure planning. We ensure that folks understand their obligations, but again, we try to connect them to as much as we can into services in the country that we know of. Again, this is not as formalized as we would like it. And then last slide here. The one thing that is key, I think, for any new program is to ensure you have, I think, buy-in from the community, and that you are constantly getting new ideas and approaches, that you're looking at as you go, your statistics, qualitative and quantitative, but you're continually advised by civil society stakeholders. And so we formed a national community reference committee that includes the United Nations, International Detention Coalition, MPI, because we want to show them data and kind of use this tool and tweak it as we go to be the next generation enforcement tool. It's, yes, it's enforcement, yes, it's case management, but it's all inclusive. And so I think that the future for us in the 21st century, what an administration has to tackle is be able to have a diverse set of tools, and it can include brick and mortar, maybe detention. Those detention places could look a little different potentially. It can include, for some, more intensive, maybe electronic monitoring, but for others, depending on their individual circumstances, you can have these broader humanitarian case management tools that would be just as effective, even though they're not as traditional for immigration compliance. All right, that's it.
So we have 1, 2. So we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers, both for Mark and for Andrew, before we take our break. So Brittany, you want to help me out? Take that one. So Brittany and I will be, I got to get some steps on my Fitbit, so I'm going to move around too. So just raise your hand and we'll do nice. 1, 2? Yeah, no.
Okay, so Andrew, I just wanted to know if you could give me an idea of how these countries are faring up in terms of resources, in-house resources, when you send the migrants back. And I know the program is pretty new, but has that happened already?
In terms of connecting them to resources back in country?
Yes.
So that is where we want more of the assistance. We are looking at making formal relationships potentially with organizations. We've talked to actors like IOM, International Social Services. That is the more difficult thing. And let me be honest to say that what I don't want to have happen is disrupt the current flow back already, because if we are seen as giving more services to this select kind of non-traditional group, the family, and not giving it to the normal adults that may go back, and a lot of them with criminal backgrounds, the host countries, the governments may be leery of that. And I don't want it to disrupt current programs already in place. And so we have to be shown that we're not doing this. One, we won't be paying for it, first of all. It's just connecting to already organizations that are there doing this. So you have to be very careful when you do this, because you don't want to disrupt the already international work we've been doing. But I think there's a model for this already, in terms of, I've seen some groups working in Mexico, and we've put them in our detention centers with those that have criminal backgrounds at the detention center in the United States, asking about what are their job skills, what's their criminal history, in order for them to go back into Mexico and actually get employment versus to recross. So there's some good models. But it's really in its nascent stage. We really have not done much. The program just launched in January. The returns we have done, we're just basically making some phone calls, so nothing formal yet. So that's why I'm kind of here talking about it.
Yeah, hi, Raul Hinojosa. Well, I'm really glad to see the work of Mark and Andrew. In a sense, maybe pushing both of you in this sort of a similar way of talking about the issue. In terms of the measurements that we're trying to achieve, right? It's spoken about the ways in which you're looking at it. I mean, another way to look at the long-term objectives, obviously, is this having an economic impact on the United States that's good, all right? And the other question is it having an impact on the sending regions and therefore addressing the transnational dimension, of people and goods as we're discussing here. One thing we've just done a study, which by the way is very similar in your numbers, and thank you very much for confirming that. But there are an issue of the costs of what this has meant. If you look at the last 25 years of expenditures, one crude way of looking at it is CPV and ICE expenditures over apprehensions. They've gone from about $1,000 per apprehension to $50,000 per apprehension. And how does that fit into our understanding of how this immigration, particularly the labor immigration, has had a dramatic impact in the trillions of dollars, actually, in terms of added to the United States. So I guess for the question for Mark would be, on the one hand, the implications for CIR, I think, are very interesting, in the sense that if you look at 2007 and 2013 bills and the amount of money that was talked about in terms of increasing for quote apprehension purposes, and it sounds, and even in your numbers, as this flatlining and even declining apprehensions done extremely well. So one way of saying is, okay, we can take that stool, that leg of the stool out of the critical part of the CIR, if you want to comment on that. And the other point is what you were making, I think, is really interesting about the reintegration process as an enforcement deterrent element. One of the we're doing comparative analysis. One word that hasn't been mentioned here is remittances. Okay, and the way in which the value of having immigrants have the ability to maintain financial asset accumulation in their countries of origin while they're here has a huge impact in terms of whether the reintegration, A, will work, and B, is attractive to them, and to what degree that's being thought about in either of yours calculations.
I think when you look at sort of strict economic cost-benefit analysis of the different enforcement options, obviously you're right. One way to estimate, or one way to describe the economic impact is sort of cost per deportation, or how much are we spending on enforcement, and how is that affecting unauthorized flows. Obviously, the other side of that balance sheet has to do with the economic impact of unauthorized immigrants, and this is a huge area of economic research, including by you and many others. And I think that when you look across all of that research, what most economists find is that unauthorized immigrants have a small net fiscal impact, because they pay taxes, they're ineligible for most kinds of services, depending on what time frame you're looking at. It's a rounding error on the U.S. budget. They don't have a big positive or negative impact. You can find a slight positive impact or a slight negative impact depending on what assumptions you make. And then in terms of their impact on the economy, how are they affecting overall GDP? How are they affecting wages for low-skilled workers? There too, you get a range of findings, but for the most part, it's a small net benefit to the U.S. economy, or some people you'll find a little bit of a larger net impact. George Borjas will find a little bit of a negative impact. But in any case, none of those numbers come close to the amount that we spend on enforcement. So strictly from an economic perspective, there's no way to justify the amount of enforcement that we spend just in terms of the impact on the U.S. economy. So the arguments for continuing to spend a lot of money on preventing unauthorized immigrants and removing unauthorized immigrants are all about sort of political culture and rule of law, and if there's a security issue. That's the only way that you could possibly justify the amount we spend on enforcement. You're never going to justify it strictly by the impact of unauthorized immigrants on the economy, because they're either a positive or a small net negative, and we spend a lot on enforcement. So there's no way economically you can justify the enforcement. It has to be because you just think unauthorized immigration is bad per se. That's my view on how I would answer your question.
And I'll just briefly touch. I really haven't explored the remittance factor, to be honest, but a majority of our mothers are coming to be with the father here already, but the returns that have happened have not been there's not been a trend to them. But the mothers have returned back with the kids. Father stays. Father wasn't enrolled in the program, or the whole family unit goes back together. Oftentimes, we actually enroll the father that's already here as a dependent on the rider mother in the program. So I haven't really studied the economic impacts of it, but it's very interesting.
Mark, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm not sure whether or not you'll be happy about answering it, but it's your
I'm
opinion,
glad I went to Mark.
not the official opinion. I wanted to ask you about the report that was leaked to the press recently by IDA, that DHS is still reviewing that report and has called into question some of DHS's previous estimates on the interdiction effectiveness rate and other things. Just like your view on that.
So I'm not going to give a detailed answer to that, but I mean, one of the things that the report, the news reports have described is that, as you said, that the IDA research finds something like a 50% apprehension rate, and Border Patrol has reported something like an 80% interdiction rate. Those are very much apples and oranges measures. I mean, they're looking at different populations and different sets of outcomes. So, you know, it's like saying, well, you said there's a 5% unemployment rate, but I'm saying, you know, GDP has increased by 2%. You know, how do you reconcile those numbers? I mean, they're just really looking at different things. So I think that it's easy to put a spin on it, like that CBP has been being dishonest, but it's really that they're measuring one thing and IDA's measuring something else. So maybe that's a specific answer to your question.
I've got one for Andrew.
You're not allowed, sir.
Yes, I am. In terms of the prospect for long-term success on the reintegration side, do you think that being able to expedite the case adjudication, the immigration case adjudication, is a critical part of that? Because if it takes 2, 3, 4 years to come up with a final order, now you're possibly entering USC dependence into the equation, totally losing touch with their home country, children, you know, non-USC kids growing up to be 3, 4, 5 years of age and having no contact, you know, with where they came from. So what's your views on the other side, the immigration court side, to facilitate reintegration?
Yeah, and just to touch back, when I was in practice in family dependency law, you wanted to ensure an efficient and pretty expeditious court process because of the issues were so important. So you got to make sure that the judge was looking at the case, that the attorneys worked together for their calendaring, that it was a pretty good court process. That, I think, is the biggest elephant in the room when you talk about immigration issues, is really putting an emphasis on the efficiency and effectiveness of the due process with regards to the court. Our families are on what's quote-unquote called an expedited docket. They are what we call adults with children on an EOR docket. Even though they may have started in family detention, they tend to have more prioritization above the non-detained but below the detained. And there's just frankly not enough judges. There's frankly, we need more access to counsel. I'm very much of an opinion of that. But you need to do that because as the family builds up these equities, it's going to be harder to unwind them and harder also to reintegrate. So you have to have a fair system, yes. It can't be so fast that they don't feel like they understand or appreciate the due process, they don't understand what's happening to them, but it has to be much more sped up than now. And the way you do that, I think, just as easy, which is more judges, more court resources, et cetera. It seems to me every time I become more and more aware of it, I don't know if the actors really want that to occur, because I do think that will be the single biggest thing in terms of an expenditure and reform, is if someone asks me where you're going to put the money is in the court process. I'd be interested in Mark's thoughts on that, but that's because that's where I feel we're lagging. We have all these resources towards more Border Patrol agents. I've grown in officers, more programs, but if there's no judicial resources, it's bottlenecked. It's a clear court bottleneck. No matter how much you prioritize, it's at the expense of some other demographic. So,
Mark, you want to add anything?
Sure. Yeah, I would totally agree with that, and I would further add that because of both changes in the demographics of who's coming and changes in the demographics of the unauthorized population that's here, the cases are getting more complex. So they require more time, and that further adds to the bottleneck.
Although there is, I mean, just put this out there, and this might be a good place for the studying. There are ways by which, again, these are administrative judges, and this is me speaking for Andrew, but there are potential asylum rights and the ability for the asylum cases could be divested from the judges into USCIS. There is a way to reallocate this, which has happened before, wherein you can't, again, it's all executive branch. So that you would still have the claims potentially with the true judicial branch if you want, but again, reallocating this. I know it's something the department's looking at, but that would be a way we could do this from an executive perspective and using the resources we have maybe at CIS or elsewhere.
Any plans to expand your program to Houston? Would seem like
that is actually, I'm glad, I should have made sure you asked that question.
He didn't pay me
The
to ask
number
that question.
one destination city for the last 12 months has been Houston. So if ever we do a new contract or expand, it'll be Houston, Dallas, and the San Joaquin Valley of California. So this city is ripe for family case management. I just pulled the stats just from January to today. 3,000 families came here from our service processing centers, from our FRCs in Texas, just at Dilly and Carnes. 3,000 families.
And we have folks in the audience, participants, who work for many of the agencies that would partner with you to deliver those services. So.
Yeah, we're going to.
So make sure that those of you that are from service agencies during the break go up and introduce yourself. So we're gonna stop the Q&A now. The afternoon is meant to engage in more of this give and take and back and forth, and we'll have facilitators to make sure that the process flows. We also have note takers to make sure that we capture the richness of the interactions. So I'm going to ask you to please look at your watches and plan to be back in your seat exactly 15 minutes from now, which puts us at 10:55. I believe coffee has been refreshed. There's still some fruit, some pastries. Mingle around the room, get to know each other. And see you back in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Give me a hard one.
And let's give another round of applause to Mark and Andrew.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, I'm married to Manoli. It's been a million years. But it was a perfect question because it's exactly what, everybody I think is sort of trying to tee up for the next administration, all the issues about asylum and case processing. It's just,
It touches everything, the adjudication process, the due process. It would be great to have an academic study to see if by adding judges, paying for court-appointed attorneys, you can actually save money.
Right.
We're spending $1.4 billion on detention. How many, is it 2 days, 3 days that you'd have to reduce average length of stay to pay for all this? But nobody wants to look at it.
I totally think it's true.
I feel like
Good. One. Let's try it again. Yeah.
If we can start making our way back to our seats, that'd be great. Can you help me figure out where the mics are? The lavalier mics. Oh, I don't know where they're at. I think the one that Andrew might still have it. Andrew, you have your lavalier mic? Okay, they got it. So if you can pass that one to Yesenia so that she's ready. Faye already has hers. Awesome. I'm just going to make a quick announcement and then I'll introduce you. Brian, and can we go to 04? Ah, thank you. Awesome. So I have a quick announcement before I introduce Faye for our federal employees. As you know, we're not allowed to give you free lunch. There is no such thing as a free lunch, right? So there are stations at the table outside for you to be able to pay either cash or with credit card. So, and right before we break, I'll make an announcement about where lunch is and what's going to happen in the afternoon. So I'm going to introduce Faye Hipsman, a colleague from the Migration Policy Institute. Faye is a policy analyst and California program coordinator in the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at Migration Policy Institute. And again, like all the speakers, her bio is in your program. Faye, I think they want you to stand up here. I think yours is off.
Is this Sorry. Does that work? Okay.
You can put that one in your palm.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and thanks to Luis and everyone at the BTI for holding this workshop. My name is Faye Hipsman. I work at the Migration Policy Institute. It's based in DC, but I am based in San Francisco. MPI is a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to the study of migration. And as Luis said, I work at the U.S. Immigration Policy Program there. My presentation today will be on shifting migrant flows at the U.S.-Mexico border. This is relevant in the context of this workshop because recent changes in who, why, where, and how people are attempting to cross the border are significant and pose new immigration enforcement and humanitarian challenges for government agencies and other stakeholders. The three topics I'll go over are apprehension trends at the U.S.-Mexico border, trends in unaccompanied children and family migrants, and Central American migrants in the immigration court and asylum systems. First, and this is an image that Mark showed us, but I'd like to set the scene with a chart of southwest border apprehensions over the last several decades. Apprehensions peaked at 1.6 million in 2000, but they're now, as you can see, near historical lows and have been for around 5 years. There are several reasons for the decline. First is US economic downturn after the Great Recession. Second, demographic changes in Mexico, like a falling birth rate for women. And 3, US immigration enforcement. It's become significantly more difficult in recent years to cross the border. These low numbers represent a new reality at the border. Flows are unlikely to rebound to levels that we saw in the 2000s, and the era of mass migration from Mexico is largely over. However, as apprehensions have decreased, there's been a really significant shift in the composition of people who still are trying to cross the border. And other folks have alluded to this too. Historically, the vast majority of border crossers have been Mexican nationals. But Mexican apprehensions have been below 200,000 for 2 years. And I'll just say right now I'm using 2016 statistics through August for most of these. But Mexican apprehensions have been below 200,000 for 2 years. And in 2016, 54% of individuals apprehended at the border were from countries other than Mexico. They're called OTMs, and OTMs are predominantly from the Northern Triangle, so countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And I'll get back to the Central American flows in a second, but first wanted to point out that while the overwhelming majority of OTM flows are from the Northern Triangle, some diverse new groups are cropping up at and between ports of entry. Oh, thanks. For example, between 2009 and 2016, non-Mexican, non-Northern Triangle apprehensions are on track to more than double. Cuban arrivals at ports of entry have increased from 24,000 in 2014 to 47,000 in 2016. And more than 5,000 Haitian nationals have arrived at ports of entry in 2016, up from just 339 the year before. Getting back to the Central Americans, a key component of these new flows are unaccompanied children and families, typically mothers with children, and they represent around half of all OTM flows, or OTM apprehensions. This trend began in 2012, but peaked in 2014 when 69,000 unaccompanied children and 68,000 family units were apprehended at the border. And at the time, these were unprecedented numbers that really touched off an operational and media crisis for the government. The numbers fell in 2015, but have rebounded in 2016. In 2016, UAC apprehensions are on track to be below their 2014 peak, while family unit apprehensions are expected to exceed the 2014 number. Altogether, since 2012, there have been 428,000 UAC and family unit apprehensions at the border. And it's important to note, like others have, that unlike traditional border crossers who try to evade border patrol, these populations seek agents out and present themselves. So it means that the apprehension numbers are generally reflective of the flows. And a quick note about 2015, the decline that we see was largely seen as a policy success by the US government to stem flows from the region. But in 2015, Mexico also stepped up its immigration enforcement. And as apprehensions in the US dropped, Mexican apprehensions rose. And what that indicates is that outflows from Central America during that year remained essentially unchanged. It was just a matter of where people were stopped. Looking at UACs by country of origin, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador tracked closely from 2009 to 2014, but they diverged in 2015, with Honduras falling the most and Guatemala falling the least. In 2016, both Guatemala and El Salvador rebounded to their 2014 levels, and Honduras remained a lot lower. Sorry. Family units show a little bit of a different pattern. In 2014, Honduras was the top sending country. In 2015, when the flows declined, the countries essentially evened out. And in 2016, El Salvador became the top sending country, representing 35% of all family unit apprehensions. Guatemala was 29%, Honduras was 26%, and another 5% of families were Mexican nationals. Over the last fiscal year, so the last 12 months, UACs and family units have arrived each month at varying levels. Apprehensions rose steadily during the winter of 2015, fell sharply in January and February of 2016, but both groups have climbed steadily since that time. And there's typically a seasonal drop in winter and around the holiday months in these apprehensions, so it remains to be seen whether that pattern will hold this winter. One important defining characteristic of these Central American flows is where they're arriving. 61% of unaccompanied children, 67% of families, and 65% of all OTMs were apprehended in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. Before these flows began to emerge, Tucson had been by far the busiest Border Patrol sector for more than a decade. But in 2014, Rio Grande Valley eclipsed Tucson as the busiest sector. Now, given that half of flows are now Central American, it's not really a surprise. South Texas has traditionally been the crossing point for these populations, chiefly because it's the shortest journey from the region. Another really important characteristic of these flows is their motivations, and we're seeing that humanitarian reasons are clearly very important. In 2016, 65,000 people initiated the asylum process at the border by expressing a fear of persecution if they're returned to their home countries. That's up from 14,000 in 2014, which is a 480% increase over just 5 years. These individuals, as background, are given a credible fear interview conducted by a USCIS asylum officer, and if credible fear is established, they're placed in immigration court proceedings where they can request asylum before an immigration judge. For those who express a fear of return, who have previously been ordered removed, the interview process is similar, but called reasonable fear. And in 78% of credible fear cases in 2016, there was a positive determination. And in family detention facilities, that screen-in rate was even higher at 89%. The top 5 nationalities for credible fear cases, in order, are El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, and then India. And this is a really important trend, not only because it lends insight into the motivations of these new flows, but because it also poses a real new challenge for government agencies. People who claim credible fear, reasonable fear at the border are processed differently, and they're interviewed by an asylum officer. So the surge in credible fear claims that we've seen recently has drawn asylum officers away from their regular duties and is placing enormous strain on the US asylum system. Taking a step back and just putting some of these things together, flows at the border are clearly becoming more humanitarian. 10 years ago, just 1% of border crossers was an unaccompanied child or someone seeking humanitarian protection. Today, that share is 1 in 3. To break it down, in 2005, there were 8,000 UAC apprehensions and 5,000 credible fear case receipts out of 1.2 million apprehensions. In 2016, to date, there were 54 UAC apprehensions and 65 credible fear case receipts out of 369 apprehensions. So these are really different dynamics at the border. Let's also quickly take a more comprehensive look at the push and pull factors driving these new flows. Why are people leaving? One important push factor is gang violence and threats, much of it gender-based, and high homicide rates in the region, so you have a lot of people who are fleeing for their lives. Another key push factor is endemic poverty and a lack of educational and work opportunity, particularly for youth in the region. One key pull factor is the presence of family members in the US. Because of the region's longstanding migration dynamics with the US, there are thousands of Central American families with 1 or 2 parents in the US and children still in Central America. And as these push factors intensify, so does the desire for families to reunify. US policies that effectively allow these populations to stay in the US for long periods of time are also important. And not necessarily a push or a pull factor, these flows have really been enabled by smuggling networks, an increasingly sophisticated smuggling industry that in recent years has really demonstrated an ability to drum up business and to adapt to new enforcement measures. And there's little agreement about which of these factors outweigh the other ones in these flows. And in all reality, the flows are mixed. And this is the real policy challenge. But ultimately, these factors are structural and deeply rooted and can't be easily or quickly alleviated. And as a result, the flows are likely to be enduring rather than short-lived. It's also important to understand that Central American children and families are treated differently at the border than most border crossers. Under a 2008 anti-trafficking law, UACs from countries other than Mexico and Canada are transferred within 72 hours to the Office of Refugee Resettlement and are then released to relatives or sponsors in the US and placed in removal proceedings. Between 2014 and August 2016, that has been the case for 128,000 children. And when it comes to family units, those who express no fear of return are generally subject to expedited removal. Those who do express fear are given a credible fear interview, and if they pass, are released with a notice to appear in immigration court. From 2014 to 2016, there have been 176,000 family unit apprehensions, but unknown shares of them, to me at least, have been given ERs versus released with NTAs. Once children and families are in immigration courts, only fractions of them have received immigration relief. Just 4% of families and about a quarter of unaccompanied children, although many UACs who have been given informal relief through the courts by having their cases closed or terminated have received formal relief from USCIS. 28% of family cases and 19% of juvenile cases have resulted in a removal order, but most of these cases are still pending. In fact, despite being prioritized on the court docket, 2/3 of juvenile and family cases filed since 2014 are still pending. The 74,000 juvenile case backlog and 84,000 family case backlog now makes up 1/3 of the entire immigration court backlog, which now stands at over 500,000 cases. Additionally, the USCIS backlog for UAC asylum cases is 10,000, and for special immigrant juvenile status is 8,000. And this month, the New York Times reported that 56,000 family cases have been delayed by the immigration courts. In some instances, like as late as 2023. In many ways, this is a free pass to stay in the country for a long time. And the rise in family unit apprehensions that we've seen at the border this past year might not be a coincidence given this practice. But more broadly, the fact that so many people are in the country as unauthorized in court with no case resolution for so many years is an enforcement and humanitarian failure, because as more people come through the courts, the delays grow and it creates an incentive for more people to come. But meanwhile, people that are deserving of protection are not getting it for many years. Another challenge for the system is that legal representation really influences immigration court attendance and case outcomes. Those with lawyers are far more likely to attend hearings, 98% of children and families, and less likely to be ordered removed, 61% of families and 12% of juveniles with lawyers. Those without lawyers, on the other hand, are less likely to attend court, that rate is under 70%, and more likely to be ordered removed. That's 96% of families and 88% of juveniles without lawyers. Moreover, those that are ordered deported, the deportations are not carried out because people are ordered deported in absentia and don't know about the order. And we don't have public data on the number of children and families who have actually been removed after this process. But at the same time as the immigration court system has left thousands of people in limbo, we are seeing a shift towards recognizing this population as refugees. The U.S. has established 3 programs that allow Central Americans who are in danger to be considered for protection from within their home countries. The first was established in December 2014 and is open to minors with parents who are lawfully present in the U.S. So far, more than 9,500 have applied, and 3,000 have been approved either for refugee status or parole. And in July, the program was expanded to a few more categories of relatives of the qualifying child or the U.S. parent. Second, the U.S. announced in July a refugee referral program open to any individuals in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And part of that program is a transfer agreement with Costa Rica that will allow a certain number of applicants, the most vulnerable and in danger applicants, to be transferred to Costa Rica while their cases are processed. And while these programs have been really slow to start and have some inherent limiting factors, they do show a potential to help a lot of people if they're scaled up and expanded. And that concludes my presentation, but I wanted to end with 4 key takeaways or concluding questions. The first, the increasing number of children, families, and asylum seekers at the border is straining border operations, the immigration courts, and the asylum system. What reforms should we be considering? In the longer term, will Central American migrants be thought of as refugees, and how is that likely to change the way they're processed? There's a growing trend in small, diverse groups arriving at the border, such as the Cubans and Haitians. Will this trend increase, and how will that influence border policies? And lastly, as flows shift away from Mexicans to other nationalities, does the current border security toolkit contain the right measures for these new populations? This includes infrastructure, technology, and personnel, but also consequences, like expedited removal or reinstatement or remote repatriation that can't be delivered to non-Mexicans, UACs, asylum seekers, or some of the new groups that we're seeing arriving at ports of entry. And that's it, and I'm happy to answer any questions during Q&A.
We're gonna hold the questions until after the second presentation
during
of this
Q&A.
piece. So this is this idea about rethinking removal and repatriation, right? It's 2023, 7 years from now. Think about where those individuals are going to be psychologically, behaviorally, socially. So so the next presentation is specific to El Salvador, and it's going to help us kind of shine a brighter light on some of the stuff that Faye just talked about. I have a colleague from El Salvador, from Plan Internacional. I'm going to try to multitask here and be a translator and a timekeeper at the same time. So I think I got it. So Yesenia Segovia is National Advisor on Gender and Child Protection for Plan Internacional El Salvador. And her presentation is on internal displacement in El Salvador as an initial step in unauthorized migration to the U.S. What's fueling it and what can be done about it. And again, her presentation will be in Spanish, and I will do my best to translate. From Salvadoran to Puerto Rican Spanish. And then from Puerto Rican Spanish to English. So please bear with me. Sí, ahora sí. Mientras más arriba lo pongas, mejor es captura. Oh, yeah, right here. That's right. There you go. ¿Listo?
Yeah, sí.
Can you hear it? Need to speak up a little bit.
Buenos días.
Oh, está tratando de conectarte de nuevo. Se desconectó. A little bit of technical difficulties to add to the translational difficulties. Did anybody bump into the projector? Maybe just loosen it in the back. No. Estos cables hacia atrás. There you go.
Pero no empiezan.
Here, no, they're adjusting it in the back. They have some setting that.
Luis, pero no empieza ahí.
La primera. Yeah. You go to the first slide, Brian. Thank you. Okay.
Listo.
Yes.
Hola, buenos días.
Good morning.
Mi nombre es Yesenia Segovia,
My name is Yesenia
de El
Segovia.
Salvador,
I'm El Salvador.
y represento a Plan Internacional.
I represent Plan Internacional.
Quiero comenzar hablando de Plan Internacional brevemente.
I'd like to begin speaking briefly about Plan Internacional.
Es una organización de desarrollo comunitario centrado en la niñez.
It's a community development organization centered on children.
Nació en 1937 y trabaja en 72 países alrededor del mundo.
1900.
37.
Started in 1937 and works in multiple countries throughout the
72
world.
países.
72 countries.
En El Salvador implementa programas desde hace 40 años.
In El Salvador, it's been implementing programs for 40 years.
Y la misión o la razón fundamental es trabajar por un mundo que promueva los derechos de los niños y la igualdad de las niñas.
And the primary mission is to work toward a world that promotes the rights of children and equality for female children in particular.
Una de las principales áreas de trabajo de Plan Internacional es la protección de la niñez,
Child protection is one of its primary work areas.
la igualdad de género
Gender equality,
y la incidencia para que los estados asuman su rol en la protección de los derechos integrales.
and advocacy so that states, governments assume their role in the protection of children.
Quisiera empezar mi ponencia, que está denominada Desplazamiento Interno en El Salvador,
I would like to start my presentation, which is titled Internal Displacement in El Salvador,
como un paso inicial en la migración no autorizada hacia los Estados Unidos,
as an initial step in unauthorized migration toward the United States,
para reflexionar un poco en relación a qué está estimulando tanto el desplazamiento interno como la migración,
to reflect on what is pushing, what is causing this internal displacement and subsequent migration,
y qué podemos hacer al respecto.
and what can we do about it.
Un punto de partida que me parece importante es definir qué entendemos por personas en desplazamiento forzado.
At first, we should have some common language and talk about what we mean by forced displacement.
Dado que el problema del desplazamiento interno forzado afecta a los países del Triángulo Norte. Ay, ¿cuál es?
Voy a la segunda.
Por favor.
Since this internal displacement is impacting in particular individuals from the northern triangle of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala.
Para el Alto Comisionado de las Naciones Unidas para los Refugiados, ACNUR,
For the High Commission of the UN for Refugees,
las personas refugiadas o desplazadas internas son personas o grupos de personas que han sido desplazadas o forzadas a huir de sus hogares para escapar del conflicto armado, la violencia generalizada, los abusos de derechos humanos o los desastres naturales provocados por el ser humano.
so the UN High Commission for Refugees defines displaced individuals as internally displaced individuals as individuals or groups of people that have been forced to flee their homes to escape armed conflict, generalized violence, human rights abuses, natural disasters, or disasters caused by human beings.
En el caso de mi país, El Salvador, voy a delimitar este desplazamiento por la causal de la violencia generalizada.
In the case of my country, El Salvador, I'm going to focus on displacement because of the generalized violence.
Y para comprender este problema es importante tener como referencia la situación de la violencia social que existe, particularmente en mi país, El Salvador.
And to better understand, it's important to have a sense of the social violence that exists, and particularly in my country.
Sí. Violencia que principalmente está siendo causada u ocasionada por los grupos de pandillas o maras, pero no solamente por estos grupos.
Violence that is typically caused by organized groups like gangs, but it's not just gang violence.
Como sabemos, estos grupos son estructuras al margen de la ley,
As we know, these groups are structures that live outside the law,
que están fuertemente organizadas,
highly organized,
cuya existencia y operatividad ha venido evolucionando con el correr de los años,
their existence and their operational skills has evolved over the years.
y que a estos grupos se le atribuyen delitos como violaciones sexuales,
And to these groups are attributed many crimes such as sexual violations,
secuestros, extorsiones,
kidnappings, extortion,
desapariciones,
disappearances,
asesinatos,
murders,
amenazas a familias y a comunidades y la presión para que se desplacen y se muevan internamente del lugar.
Threats to families and entire communities and pressure for these families and communities to leave and cede the territory to the gangs.
En ese sentido, y a pesar de los esfuerzos que hace el gobierno de mi país,
In that sense, and despite the efforts of my government in El Salvador,
la situación de violencia social se ha agudizado,
the social violence situation has become worse,
generando lo que ahora entendemos y conocemos como el desplazamiento forzado,
generating what we now understand as forced displacement,
y que está directamente vinculado también con la migración no autorizada para este país y para otros países.
and which is tied directly to the unauthorized migration toward the United States and toward other countries.
Hacemos siguiente. Por ejemplo, el año 2015 fue considerado como el año más violento de nuestra historia salvadoreña.
For example, 2015 has been considered the most violent year in our history in El Salvador.
Según datos oficiales de nuestra Policía Nacional Civil,
According to stats from our National Civil Police,
en el 2015 se registraron un total de 6.670 homicidios.
there were 6,670 murders in 2015.
Y en lo que va de enero a agosto de este año,
And from January to August of 2016,
se reportan 3.837 homicidios.
we're looking at 3,837 murders.
Muchos de estos homicidios están asociados al accionar de los grupos de pandillas o maras.
And many of these murders are related to the actions of gangs.
En relación a la violencia sexual,
In terms of sexual violence,
de enero a agosto, la Policía Nacional Civil
from January to August, the National Police
ha reportado un total de 1.718 denuncias por violencia sexual, agresiones, acoso, abuso sexual, principalmente, no exclusivamente, pero principalmente también derivada de grupos violentos.
And so they've recorded, the National Police has recorded 1,718 cases of sexual violence from accosting all the way up to violations. And the majority, principally the actors, although not exclusively, are gang members.
Sabemos, y en mi organización hemos tenido conocimiento de casos en donde pandilleros identifican a las niñas y a las adolescentes y las eligen como regalo o como premio para su jefe, el jefe de la clica.
We know in many cases, and my organization works with many of these young ladies or girls who are identified by gang members as a gift to their gang leader.
Por lo cual, la condición de género y la edad son dos variables importantes a tomar en cuenta en este fenómeno.
As such, gender and age are two very critical variables to consider in this phenomena.
En relación a las personas desaparecidas, de enero a agosto de este año,
With regards to disappeared persons from January to August of 2016,
se contabiliza un total de 1.269 personas desaparecidas.
there have been reports of 1,269 disappeared people.
Y la edad en donde se concentra la mayor cantidad de personas es de 12 a 30 años.
And the primary age of these disappeared individuals are 12 to 30 years of age.
El secuestro es otro de los principales problemas, aunque ha disminuido considerablemente.
Kidnapping is another problem, although it has decreased significantly.
Y en relación a las extorsiones,
And in terms of extortion,
que son ocasionadas o presionadas por los grupos delincuenciales,
which are typically performed, these extortions, by these delinquent groups,
en el año 2015, las autoridades reportaban que solo en una cantidad reducida de 714 personas
in 2015,
habían cancelado un total de de 714 personas,
714 people
habían pagado un total
had paid a grand total
de 1.2 millones de dólares en extorsiones.
of $1.2 million in extortion money.
De enero a agosto de este año,
From January to August of this year,
Las autoridades reportan
authorities report
1.498 denuncias por extorsión.
1,498 reports of extortion.
Pero ¿qué tiene que ver todo esto con el desplazamiento interno y con la posterior migración? Según el informe,
So what does this all have to do with internal displacement and migration?
según el informe de ACNUR, del Alto Comisionado de Naciones Unidas,
According to the report from the High Commission at the UN,
en el 2015 los países que integramos el Triángulo Norte
in 2015, the countries that integrate the Northern Triangle
reportamos un total de 110.000 personas desplazadas a lo interno de nuestros países.
reported a total of 110,000 people displaced within country.
Por su parte, el Consejo Noruego para Personas Refugiadas
And on the other hand, the Norwegian Council for Refugee Individuals or for Refugees
reportó en el 2015 289.000 personas salvadoreñas desplazadas a lo interno de mi país.
The Norwegian Council on Refugees reported that in 2015 there were 289,000 people displaced internally in El Salvador alone.
El desplazamiento forzado al momento no ha sido reconocido por el gobierno de mi país,
Internal displacement, forced internal displacement up till now has not been recognized by my government in El Salvador.
sin embargo, a medida que van pasando los meses, este problema va incrementando.
But as time goes by, the problem continues to increase.
Desde Plan estamos teniendo conocimiento de familias que están desplazándose
In Plan, we know of families that are being displaced
porque los pandilleros llegan, amenazan y dan un tiempo definido para que la familia salga de esa comunidad.
The gang members arrive, they make their threat, and they give the family a time limit to leave the community.
De noviembre del año pasado a esta fecha, solo en Plan hemos atendido a más de 80 familias desplazadas internamente.
From November of 2015 to date, Plan Internacional El Salvador alone has worked with over 80 families that have been displaced in this manner.
¿Por qué ocurre el desplazamiento interno forzado?
Why does this forced displacement,
Desde una
why does it
mirada,
occur?
desde una mirada teórica, el desplazamiento forzado sucede en los lugares en donde el Estado ha perdido su presencia o la presencia es débil y ha disminuido.
In theory, it occurs in a space where the government has lost its role or its presence or its force.
Y esto se traduce en ese poco acceso que tienen las personas de zonas excluidas a el goce de sus derechos.
And that translates as a decreased access to the enjoyment of your rights for these individuals.
Estos grupos violentos lo que hacen es disputar el poder al Estado en esas localidades.
These violent groups are actually vying for power with the state in these local communities.
Pero ¿cuál es el destino de las personas desplazadas?
And what's the destiny of displaced individuals?
Consideramos que el desplazamiento interno forzado es una de las variables que está contribuyendo para que muchas familias busquen en la migración irregular una alternativa.
This is one of the reasons, the push factors why many families are looking towards irregular immigration or unauthorized immigration as an alternative.
Sin escatimar los riesgos que esta decisión puede traerles, deciden emprender el viaje o enviar a sus hijos e hijas
Regardless of the risks that this course of action, this irregular migration can take, they decide to undertake the journey themselves or to send their sons and daughters.
porque en su afán por proteger a los niños y niñas, por proteger a su familia de los grupos que allá operan, buscan en la migración una posibilidad de salvaguardar sus vidas.
In the desire to protect their family, to protect their sons and daughters, they look at immigration as a way to save their lives.
Si bien las personas desplazadas internas deben de gozar de los derechos que nuestro Estado debe proveerles,
Internally displaced folks should be able to enjoy the rights that the state affords them.
porque mientras no salgan de nuestro país, es el Estado quien debe garantizar todos los derechos
Because while they're still in our country, it is the state that should guarantee all their rights.
En el trayecto, mientras se desplazan de su comunidad y logran instalarse en otra zona o ubicarse en otra zona, muchos de sus derechos se ven afectados.
In reality, in the process of internal displacing from their home communities to other communities, many of their rights are impacted.
Muchos niños y niñas se quedan sin estudiar.
Many children, boys and girls, are not going to school.
Viven temporalmente en un albergue,
They're living temporarily in a shelter.
en la clandestinidad,
They live under the radar illegally in a clandestine manner.
porque si salen del albergue o si se movilizan a otra comunidad que es cercana a la comunidad de donde se desplazaron,
Because if they leave the shelter or they move towards a community that's geographically close to the one that they've been pushed out of,
el riesgo de ser asesinados por los grupos violentos es una realidad.
the risk of being murdered by these violent groups is a reality.
Podemos pasar.
Yes, ma'am.
Si bien existe un marco normativo internacional y nacional,
Aye?
si bien existe un marco normativo a nivel internacional y nacional que sustenta toda la problemática del desplazamiento interno forzado,
Whereas there is a normative framework nationally and internationally that deals with these issues,
mientras no exista un reconocimiento oficial,
until there is an official recognition,
las acciones que se hagan para la prevención y la atención
the actions that are taken in prevention and in intervention
seguirán siendo limitadas.
will continue to be limited.
Sin embargo, reconocemos los esfuerzos que se están haciendo desde el Estado salvadoreño,
Nevertheless, we recognize that there are some efforts underway by the Salvadoran state,
pero consideramos que es importante ahondar en la investigación
but it is critical that we do more research
para conocer todas las aristas que rodean a este
to
fenómeno.
really understand in depth the complexity of this phenomena.
¿Qué es lo que estamos haciendo en general? Por parte del gobierno se han dado pasos significativos para atender de manera integral el problema de la violencia social.
The government has taken steps to attend to this problem in a holistic, integrated way.
En el año 2015 se creó el Plan El Salvador Seguro,
In 2015, the program El Salvador Seguro Safe El Salvador was created,
que es un instrumento que busca promover la seguridad a través de la atención de 4 ejes:
which seeks to promote safety by paying attention to 4 different points.
la prevención, la atención a víctimas,
Prevention, attention to victim services,
la represión o perseguimiento del delito,
containment, or pursuing these groups, these delinquent groups,
y la reintegración o reincorporación al tejido social.
and reintegrating them into the social fabric.
Se están impulsando programas de prevención que busca atender o llevar respuesta a las comunidades históricamente más excluidas.
There are also programs underway to bring prevention efforts to some of the communities that historically have been the most excluded and marginalized, and to the schools in those communities.
Algunas organizaciones no gubernamentales e internacionales como Plan
Some organizations and NGOs and government organizations as well, like Plan was an NGO,
estamos impulsando acciones de prevención y de atención directa a víctimas.
are undertaking efforts for prevention, but also victim services.
Se gestiona refugios o albergues,
They're creating shelters, temporary shelters.
se brinda atención psicológica y médica,
They are offered psychological and medical services.
y estamos haciendo gestiones con el gobierno para trabajar de manera conjunta en atención directa a estas personas.
And they're doing outreach with the government so that they can work together to help these families.
Pasamos. Para concluir, quisiera referirme a los retos o lo que falta por hacer.
In conclusion, I'd like to talk about the challenges or what is left to do.
Primero, es importante continuar con la investigación.
It's very important to continue with the research.
Al momento existe poca data, por lo tanto, hay muchas aristas, muchas variables que están siendo invisibilizadas.
We really are lacking in a lot of data, so there are many very relevant variables that are invisible. We don't even know about them.
El desplazamiento interno forzado no es nuevo.
The internal forced displacement is not a new phenomenon.
Sin embargo, no tenemos la suficiente documentación ni data para poder ahondar en su atención.
But we don't have the proper documentation or data to dig a little bit deeper on what's happening right now.
Por parte del Estado, hace falta el diseño de políticas públicas más integrales que le apunten a la prevención y a la atención de las víctimas.
On the part of the state, we need public policies that are better integrated and that have to deal with
A las víctimas, de atención directa a las víctimas.
direct services to victims.
Además, enfocar las acciones en las comunidades en donde hoy por hoy los índices de violencia son más altos.
And also to focus their efforts in communities that we know have the highest indices of violence.
Y es importante vincular o establecer esa relación directa que hay entre desplazamiento interno forzado, migración hacia el exterior.
And it's really important to take a closer look, a more in-depth look at the relationship between this internal forced migration, displacement, and migration towards outside of the country.
Para que el diseño de programas de prevención estén enfocados y sean mejor orientados a las personas o a los grupos en mayor riesgo y en mayor vulnerabilidad.
So that the prevention programs are tailored and focused on the highest risk groups, the most vulnerable groups.
Para Plan Internacional sigue siendo un reto trabajar en este tema, sin embargo, tenemos toda la disponibilidad de continuar, estamos dando pasos hacia esto, estamos teniendo muy buenas relaciones de coordinación con el gobierno y con otras instituciones y consideramos que si atendemos a tiempo este problema del desplazamiento, disculpa.
For Plan Internacional, this is a challenge that we take seriously. We're up to the task, and we're working on developing partnerships with the government and with other organizations to pay attention to these issues.
Podemos tener mejores resultados, tanto en la prevención como en la atención directa.
And we know that through that collaboration, we can have better results both on the prevention side and on the direct services side.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. So now we can go to some Q&A for both Yesenia and Faye. So Tamara, you want to have, I think Brittany's taking a call. With the other mic? There should be two. You can just raise your hands and we'll bring the mics to you. Where's the other mic? Oh.
Yesenia, ¿en español o en inglés? Bueno, te lo hago en español. No, me llama la atención porque tal y como usted dijo, no es un problema nuevo para El Salvador, después de las guerras civiles, etc. Entonces, ¿por qué el gobierno no reconoce este desplazamiento interno forzado, a pesar de los esfuerzos que está haciendo para mejorar la situación? Pero, ¿cuál es el motivo por el cual no lo reconoce?
Question in English and Spanish, and I'll just translate the answer.
Yeah, just basically, why isn't the government recognizing this internal forced displacement?
And you said, especially since, as Yesenia said, it's not a new problem, and you alluded to the Civil War.
It's a small country.
Bueno, al momento tampoco hay una posición oficial del desconocimiento, del no reconocimiento. El gobierno.
There isn't an official position on the side of not recognizing it either. So the government hasn't taken a position either way.
El gobierno plantea que en este desplazamiento de familias hay grupos violentos que son los que se están desplazando por las rencillas entre los grupos contrarios.
The government, for example, puts forward the idea that there are other violent groups that are being displaced because some groups are more violent than others.
Considera entonces que no todas las familias son en sí víctimas, sino que son también victimarios que están huyendo de la represión del grupo contrario.
So that they don't consider all families as just victims, but also part of the problem, and they're just fleeing the repression from a counter group. So intergroup violence.
Sin embargo, reconoce que sí hay zonas en donde efectivamente hay desplazamiento, pero que hay poca investigación. De hecho, en este momento está impulsando el Ministerio de Justicia y Seguridad Pública una investigación para ahondar en el tema.
The government does recognize that there are areas where it is happening, and they've commissioned one of the ministries or departments to conduct some more in-depth research and try to get to the bottom of it. Other questions?
Yeah, hi. To both these very interesting presentations. UCLA, we've started a project that with the Ministry of the Economy of El Salvador, where we have detailed municipal level to zip code data in terms of migration patterns in between El Salvador and the United States. And a couple of, and which has been just recently released with an interparliamentary group we're doing with the Central American and Mexican parliaments. And what's interesting is that if you look at it from the transnational perspective, a couple of things, and also historical, you start seeing a couple of things that I think are relevant. One is that this phenomena of the unaccompanied children is actually a cyclical phenomena, and that we predicted a few years ago was actually going to recover again with the economic recovery, because what our econometric study of this pattern shows is that essentially it's and this is a violence issue is something I want to deal with, that our data shows that the presence of murder in municipalities is basically white noise compared to what's driving the migration patterns. What's driving the migration pattern primarily is the existence of a social network to the United States to particular areas. The stronger the social network, the more migration that you're likely to see, associated with economic differences and also economic impact. In other words, as the economic recovery proceeds, they are able the network is able to activate the movement of people more quickly. When during the recession, which is when the trough of the pattern was occurring, you saw a decline from the early 2000s down to the bottom, and now we're seeing a recovery. So the economic issues are really fundamental in terms of your pull factors. I didn't see an economic demand as an aspect of that. So a very important issue. And the other way, I'm frankly torn about how to talk about this, because on the one hand, the data is showing that if you look at, like I said, murder rates, which have, by the way, dropped by 50% in this year, right, in El Salvador, at the same time that your data shows a spiking of Salvadorian outmigration, right? What is interesting, though, is that the extortion rates are significant. Violence, I mean, not violence, but the extortion. But if you add up, even using your numbers on extortion, right? We've done this calculus. How much do the gangs make all year in these basic extortions and these petty extortions? It's about $75 million, right? And we're about to spend 1.5 billion in the Northern Triangle Partnership for Prosperity. And nowhere have I heard much of a discussion, it's been mentioned, about this issue specifically of how to deal with the fact that what is also extremely significant is the amount of young men, mostly young men, who are without school and without employment. I mean, literally, and the cost basically of employing them all would be about $75 million. Okay, it's sort of a depressing situation in the sense that I think this whole issue has been a bit mischaracterized. It could use some transnational frameworks in terms of how to actually move resources to attack root problems. You want to respond? I'd love to get some comments.
Yeah, I think your comments totally highlight that, how the flows are really mixed and how there are a lot of people coming because they're being driven out by things like violence, but that economic factors are really important, and just the disparities between the US economy versus the Central American economies, and the number of young people there who don't have educational and work opportunities and can't earn money. And you hear things about droughts too, which is making it hard for people in agriculture to make a living. So I think that is important. That was missing from my slide. I don't know how I forgot to put that on there, but I think that's spot on.
Including gang members.
Uh-huh.
Talk about trying to integrate them back into society,
Yeah.
right? But where are the jobs? Where are the opportunities?
Definitely.
I see Crystal shaking her head. She works with gang youth. Yesenia, would you like to respond? Yeah. Bueno, estaba haciendo más bien un comentario, doctor Hinojosa, de que este aspecto de los asesinatos, aunque es serio, en realidad el problema es un problema económico. Que si miramos las cifras de asesinatos están disminuyendo, mientras que las cifras de extorsión, por ejemplo, están aumentando, y el ingreso de las maras, de las pandillas, aproximadamente 75 millones al año. Y la dificultad de buscar una solución económica que permita crear oportunidades y empleo para todos estos jóvenes que están siendo desplazados, incluyendo los de las pandillas.
Sí, sí, es cierto. Los asesinatos han reducido a partir de este año, a partir de la implementación del Plan El Salvador Seguro. Sí hay una disminución, y yo lo mencionaba también, y si se ve comparativamente con años anteriores hay una significativa reducción. Hay otros, por ejemplo, el secuestro también ha disminuido, pero hay otros delitos que están incrementando, por ejemplo, la violencia sexual. El tema mismo del desplazamiento forzado tiene una tendencia también a ir aumentando. Eso es cierto. Yo mencionaba que delimitaba mi intervención al desplazamiento forzado por violencia social. Sin embargo, la violencia en general, y más bien también toda la realidad de la migración, por supuesto que tiene otras variables también, u otras concomitantes que están ahí a su alrededor. El tema de la reunificación familiar, el tema económico, también son variables que están impulsando a muchas familias a que decidan migrar. Sí, es una realidad. En este caso, para efectos de esta presentación, sí delimité al tema de la violencia social.
In short, they're in agreement. So you guys can duke it out in the afternoon. So we have time for one or two more questions. Yes.
Just a quick comment in response. And I'm very much in agreement with what Yesenia just said about, at the same time that the homicide rates have gone down, we see other crimes, and this is a modus operandi we really see with gangs, and we've seen this. So I'm with Kids in Need of Defense. We've got 10 offices across the U.S. where we're representing unaccompanied children and also working with some programs in Central America. We've seen incredible rates of sexual and gender-based violence and these other types of crimes that are, so, in the homicide rates, you don't pick up on these types of crimes, which are, the other piece is, I think that this gets left out a lot, but the connection between economics and opportunities and violence. So, for example, we in the Central American Minor In-Country Refugee Processing Program, we're working with some children who have cases pending in El Salvador and Honduras. And we have seen a number of cases, and we see this in the US with our kids that we're representing as well, who, you're right, they weren't going to school, they weren't working. So you might think that and you can say, I wasn't going to school, I wasn't working, but why weren't they going to school? They were going to school, and the gang had a really strong presence in their school. Or they were going to school, but on the bus, on the way to school, they were targeted or witnessed somebody else be targeted, and that really affects their ability to go to school. Or they're thinking about getting a job, but their brother is working and is paying a renta to the gang. The people around them are, being forced to pay, and so, does it make sense to even go down that road, or are they living in a neighborhood where they can leave? I mean, is there a curfew? Are they if they cross the bridge, leaving their neighborhood, are they going to be safe? Right? There's all those. So there really is very strong connection between the violence and the economics from what we're seeing, and I think that piece, unfortunately, doesn't get. I think we are too often in the U.S. separating: is it violence or is it? And it's really that combination. So.
I just had a question. Would you repeat the amount of money that is planned to be invested in the Prosperity Alliance for the Prosperity?
Appropriations are 1.5 billion at this point for the Partnership for Prosperity of the Northern
So there was another 750 million approved because the initial was 750 million,
Maybe it's 750 a year.
Yeah.
which is no small change, but something that I always like to remember is that in Guatemala, which is smaller than in El Salvador, immigrants send 6 billion a year. So those are two figures, I think.
The remittances are less than in Salvador. Yeah. Wow. René.
Salvador is 4 billion, Guatemala is close to 8.
Yeah.
You know, so it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
That should not be talked about here yet.
I'm going to give Dr. Olate, I have to make an executive decision, give Dr. Olate the last word to make it count. And then we'll go to our, you're standing
Yes.
between the last two presenters and lunch.
I would like to make a comment about that. When a variable is trying to explain 100% of a reality, the variable doesn't work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we say that violence is explaining all the cases, well, I receive a phone call from a lawyer almost 3-5 times a month asking me, can you say that this is a situation of violence in San Salvador? This is a situation of violence, gang violence. I say a formal threat, can you say that? Anybody can say that.
Yeah.
Anybody can say that it's a situation of violence in San Salvador.
Mm-hmm.
Again, when we use a variable and this variable is explaining 100% of reality, this variable doesn't work. Yes, I completely agree about the cycle, right? I will show tomorrow very simple system dynamic modeling to explain violence or to explain a problem or solution in San Salvador or in any country. And I think that we are lacking to see the systemic approach to problems.
Yeah.
And the problem is not just economic problem, it's a problem of governance. In El Salvador, it's a governance problem. So youth gang members, thanks to the implementation of policies supported by this country and funded by this country, the number of youth gang members have increased. More youth gang members in prisons, more youth gang members in communities. This is a failure of policies.
And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk in the afternoon about how to fix it, right? What we can do to fix it. Okay, so we're going to switch gears, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker. We have two more speakers before we break for lunch. Natalie Lumert is a special advisor, custody programs, enforcement and removal operations at U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the Department of Homeland Security, and her full bio is in your program.
Thanks,
Natalie.
Luis. Everybody, can you hear me all right? I just picked up the microphone. Great, thank you. A little context before I get into this program. Oh.
The right arrow.
Thank you. I work with Andrew in custody programs. You heard Andrew speak this morning about family case management. I've been with custody programs and ICE for a little over a year. I came from the NGO world. One of the things that I really appreciate about where I am is it's a unique division that brings together attorneys, immigration enforcement officers, social workers, and policy folks together to sit in the same room and talk about new and innovative programs in a productive way. And it's been fascinating to me of what we can achieve when we bring different viewpoints, different perspectives together. And so we're doing a lot on a daily basis of what I think we're trying to achieve here in our workshop. One of our newest programs is trauma-informed care. It's even newer than family case management. We just started this summer, and in fact, just in the past month, we started doing some of the concrete work in some of the detention facilities. So trauma-informed care, TICP, was born out of a need to complement the existing services at the facilities for women in particular. By existing services, I mean the clinical mental health that have already existed in the facilities. The goal is to reduce the risk of re-traumatizing survivors and creating a more trauma-informed environment. And then also, we want to assist with the next step, where there's safe release planning.
I'm not going to go and explain trauma to this group. Obviously, you all know what that is. You know about this population that we're talking about, the trauma in home country, the trauma in the migration route, but also it's stressful, as you know, in the process of immigration proceedings. Before coming to ICE, I worked with refugee populations who were resettling to the US, who had status and who were eligible for services and who had a support group. And that can be traumatic because it's a new country, new culture, new language. Imagine also being in that situation and you don't have status and you're going through the immigration process, which, as we talked about this morning, can take a long time, and you're in a limbo situation and you don't know what's going to happen. Very stressful situation. And then layer on top of that, you're in a facility where, frankly, in my opinion, you don't have a lot of control over what's happening on a daily basis. So in that context, we are creating this trauma-informed program. We want it to be from a strength-based approach, and we want to affirm the strengths and the resilience of the women who are in the facility. I want to point out to you my colleague, Teresa Ramirez, if you can raise your hand. Teresa is here in Houston and is one of the trauma response coordinators implementing the program in the facility here. And she is going to be my, as they say, lifeline when you ask me questions I don't know the answer to. She's going to answer them for me. Okay. Oh, this seems to be in a different, it skips quickly, doesn't it? Yeah, there we go. Okay. There's two pillars, staff training and resident programming, which I'll get into in a little bit. We have, as I mentioned, the trauma response coordinators in several facilities, which I'll mention. They all have a degree in social work or related field. They're all fluent in Spanish, and they all have experience providing trauma-informed care. I learned this morning that Teresa here has decades of experience. She's retired and coming back to give her gifts to this area, and in fact, she even was taught classes in social work at the University of Houston. So we're really fortunate to have her here. It's important to state that the program is not doing clinical mental health per se, although it is assisting with making those connections. The program was developed and is being implemented with input of an interagency working group on trauma that meets monthly, and these folks are looking at everything from how we're designing it, our standard operating procedures, and includes leaders from SAMHSA, Office of Violence Against Women, ICE Health Service Corps, and the White House Advisor on Violence Against Women. Okay. These are the locations thus far. We have a full-time TRC, Trauma Response Coordinator, in these facilities. They are here in Hutto, in Corley, in Texas, soon to be in 2 more facilities, and then there are 2 in the family residential centers, and those are some of the stats and numbers. We also have a national manager in Washington, D.C. in custody programs, Dina Huff. She assists with ensuring this information flow among the TRCs, supporting them, liaisoning with the interagency group, and looking at program outcomes. It's an interesting model where you have trauma response coordinators working together, but frankly, on their own in different facilities. So it's important to have somebody that assists with them nationally. And as you can see, the length of stay is different from a family residential center versus some of the regular centers for women. And so we're looking at that and how that might differ in the implementation of the program. So for example, with the family residential services, because the length of stay is much shorter, we're looking at how do we make sure that we can give the tools to women who are then going to be released into communities across the country to make sure that they have, for example, information about hotline numbers as simple as who to call if they are in trouble.
And I'll get into a little more of that later. Okay. Two pillars. One is the staff training, and then the second is the residential programming objective with staff training. So what we're trying to do here is to facilitate a more trauma-informed care environment where we are reducing risk of re-traumatization. We're increasing staff understanding of trauma among the women themselves and its impact on behavior, and then increase the staff awareness of their own responses to their own responses within the facility when there is some sort of trauma exhibited. We hope this will influence the facility throughout the processing, throughout the individuals involved with interacting with the women. The resident programming will include the group educational support, individual support through referrals and release planning, and then individual empowerment to build coping skills. And next is a visual that shows some of the basis of our approach. So on the right here, we are adapting some of the framework and the approach from SAMHSA. For those of you who are not familiar, that's the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. The 4 R's, so to speak, of realizing the impact, recognizing the signs and symptoms, responding in an integrated way, and then resisting re-traumatization. Those would be the 4 R's to assist with building the trauma-informed environment. We have a little visual here. You're going in the house, facilitating the intake to the referrals, the trauma support groups and services, and then the release planning and removal as folks leave. One note, it is the services for the women are voluntary. The staff training is mandatory, I hope. Staff training. New staff will receive an introductory training, and then they will also receive ongoing refresher and advanced training. The model we're using is the SAMHSA GAIN Center curriculum that has been useful in understanding the core issues about trauma. There's 7 modules to this. This includes staff understanding what trauma is, the individual differences that are raised within the trauma responses, and trauma-informed systems, and then personal action planning for a more trauma-informed approach. Resident programming. We are using a specific, there was a lot of research that was done into what curriculum could we use for the resident programming. This is a little unique situation. We decided on a seeking safety curriculum that has been used in residential environments and also with foreign-born populations. The main goals are to reduce the trauma, increase safe coping behavior, and the key characteristics are, what's interesting about it is that it addresses trauma without requiring the participants to speak directly to their personal experiences, which is important, so that it can be a safe environment for them. It's designed to be maximal within a short period of time, given that we do have a lot of people leaving in a short period of time, and this is important because of the length of stay. But at the same time, it does have 25 different curriculum topics that can be presented by a non-clinical provider. Another important component is confidentiality. This obviously is a concern that comes up a lot. We want to make sure that the women feel safe in sharing their information. So what they do share in the group is confidential, except for a few circumstances. For example, if there's a mandatory child abuse neglect situation, a threat of harm to self or others in the facility, or any information about a potential sex abuse situation occurring in the facility. This is an example of a flyer that the women might see in the facility about the programming. And we chose the lotus flower as a symbol. Can anybody tell me what the lotus flower represents? Any Buddhists in particular might know? Yes? Pardon?
The Lotus Sutra, considered to be by the teacher Daishonin to be the utmost essence of devotion.
I wasn't aware of that, but I believe you. That's good. But yeah, anybody else? That's right. Exactly, exactly. The flower symbolizes rising from a dark place into beauty and rebirth. Lotus flowers grow out of the mud, and they produce beautiful blossoms. And in Buddhism, they're a symbol of strength among strength among adversity. So as I mentioned, we just started, but it has been so far well received among the women. They are coming back and they appreciate it. You know, sometimes the facilities, in my opinion, there's not enough programming as it is, so it offers something else, and it assists them at a difficult time. Then there's individual assistance as well. As I mentioned, we want to help them on the next step. So we may be referring them to specific individual release planning, particular to their situation, where they may be going in the US next. Or we may be helping them to connect with the mental health services that are in the facility. One of the stakeholders that we're collaborating with, for example, is the ICE Homeland Security Investigations Victim Assistance Specialists that are in many of the communities across the country. Prevention is a huge part of this as well. We want them to be aware, for example, of what trafficking is, what they could do if they're in a domestic violence situation. And then in the weekly groups, we're also going to be distributing national resources like national hotline numbers. Dina Huff is a great contact for nationally for this program. I was thinking about what are some questions that we struggle with, that we have, that I anticipate that we'll be asking ourselves in the implementation of this program. I think one of the things that we try to do as much as possible in our division is to have a learning attitude and approach to what we're doing, to continually evaluate and have a continual quality improvement approach. And so we are going to continue to learn from this, what's working, what's not. One question, perhaps for the group, is how you think we might evaluate something like this, given the quick turnaround, given what we're trying to achieve in those different pillars. How do we, in a practical way, give referrals to the women who may be returning home or may be returning anywhere, going anywhere in the US? Who should we be collaborating with? And it also relates to the earlier conversation. How do we support those who are returning in the reintegration and the difficulty there? It's an interesting program because it's also, while trauma-informed care environment is standard now, right, in social services, everybody talks about that, it's a given, and when you're developing a program, this is new for ICE. You know, I'm not going to lie, I'll be honest with you. You know, some people not really sure. Why do we need this? So how do we convince people? You know, I told you earlier I work with immigration officers very closely, and just last week some of them were telling me, you know, when somebody's mental health concerns are taken care of, I can work with them better. And they're better able to understand what their obligations are, and they're in a better position to comply. So it does assist them, but not everybody's on board. But how can we help more with with that thinking. So that's all I have. Thank you for listening.
So we can take questions now for both Natalie and Lisa. I think I need more coffee. Oh, you're present. Oh, yeah, you're presenting. I really need coffee. You haven't even presented yet. So. No, it's okay. I've read all the presentations, so they're all in my head. So it's quite all right. That's 07.
So
Thank you, Brian.
can you
So
hear me?
Lisa Friedman is Director for Regional Policy and Initiatives for Kids in Need of Defense.
Okay. Do I have to do that, or can you hear me if I do that?
Maybe slide.
Or I'll just hold it. I'm going to do that because I don't want to bend down. Okay, good, great. So thank you so much. Great to be here. And I think some really interesting conversations have come up so far, and I very much look forward to more. I'm going to focus on the reintegration issue that's come up, in several of the conversations, and particularly going to focus this on obviously a very narrow lens, which is KIND's experience in this area in reintegration. We've launched a pilot project in 2011 focused on reintegration for unaccompanied children and started in Guatemala and have mostly been in Guatemala. And I'm really going to talk about this through that lens, what we have seen, what we have learned, what the challenges are that we have observed. And then, we'll continue this more as part of the small discussion later. And just to really briefly, because I think so often, and this has already been mentioned here, or until more recently, the focus has seemed to really be on what happens in the U.S. So immigrants get to the U.S. and what happens, and if they get removed or they take voluntary departure, much less of a focus on what happens following return. And that piece is so, so critical to all of this, especially because we see remigration, especially because the migration sort of trajectory, we see it at KIND, is starts in the home country, goes during migration, continues, in countries of transit, countries of destination, and then for folks who go back, continues once they're back. So it's really a much longer story. And there's a lot we can learn about migration, looking also at what happens once folks go back. So we think that piece is critical. To really briefly mention, because it's a newer area of focus, so folks know there has been greater attention paid, particularly since 2014, since the increase of unaccompanied children and families in 2014. There's been greater attention to what we call sort of immediate reception needs of returning migrants. So prior to 2014, especially folks working in the unaccompanied children world were very concerned about what happened to kids once they were returned in the immediate. So someone could show up and say, I'm an uncle, I'm a parent, and very, very little sort of checking into who this person was. And also NGOs that we worked with in Central America saying, traffickers would be waiting right outside the airport, or the bus station where kids got off a bus to be ready to take them back on another journey, or smugglers or traffickers. So there has been a shift with that, and I think a positive shift, that there's been a lot more attention to the immediate kind of reception needs. USAID worked with the International Organization for Migration to develop these reception centers in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. There are family centers for shelters for unaccompanied children. There are also reception centers for returning adults on their own. And there's much more for the unaccompanied children. There's much more sort of checking or screening to make sure that it's safe for a child to go back to the people who are claiming to be family. There's official processes that take place. There's protocols. So that's been a real improvement. I'm going to focus not on that as much as on what happens once kids are back in their home communities, because that's like the first, 24, 48, really maximum 72 hours in these reception centers. And if folks are interested, I'm happy to talk about what's going on there, but it's really the greater challenge is what happens once they're home. In 2011, KIND launched a project that started in Guatemala, the Child Migrant Return and Reintegration Project, and KIND really focuses on unaccompanied children. So this issue I'm just going to make the statement now, and I'll come back to it at some point where relevant.
absolutely think that reintegration work is important and reintegration services are needed much beyond the unaccompanied children, but our experience and our focus is on unaccompanied children. So it's a small project. It's been a pilot. We've assisted 153 children who've returned to their countries with kind of longer term services, and more children who've wanted information while in the United States, who've wanted to consider the option, or who were going back to their communities but not in areas that we have programs, and we connected them to other NGOs depending if we had connections. And our project has been focused in Guatemala, like I mentioned. This summer in August, I guess, we launched a small project also with Casa Alianza in Honduras. So we're serving a small number of children that's just started in certain parts of Honduras. And in our small project, we've had a pretty good success rate of children being able to stay at home, 80% of those children. And the idea is, as we've all been saying, once you go back, there's been a lot of changes for people that they've experienced in the migration journey. And really, if you're able to step back and look at what are the reasons this child came and to connect them to the issues that sort of address those reasons, we've been able to see children be able to remain. So I'll come back to that, but I did want to just set the background of where this is coming from. So so a lot of this is going to be on lessons learned through our project. What are the challenges that we see children experience on return? So in particular, if children are returning to unsafe conditions, let's just, and really in El Salvador, for example, where we do not have a project, but I've talked to folks who've been doing reintegration work there. If you're from a community that you were forced to flee because of violence, there's a reintegration project that involves children going to centers post return to their communities and accessing services through these centers. But I've heard from people working, with folks at those centers that a lot of the kids never even make it to the center. They remigrate before they even make it to their first appointment at the center. And that's this piece, the violence, the connection of violence. If that's a reason that a child left, or a significant reason a child left, and the conditions haven't changed, that's going to be a major, major challenge on return. Trauma, so we've just heard from Natalie about trauma. I think, we see trauma in a way on return too, because if a child's experienced violence during the journey, or if they fled because of violence, or if they've been in detention, especially long term, trauma absolutely may be one of the issues they're experiencing at the time of return. But regardless of trauma, there are definitely mental health needs. There's significant sense of disappointment. Some children feel really depressed. They feel like failures if they didn't make it. And there's a ton, that's on the next page, but I'll jump forward and back. Ton of worry about debt to smugglers. We've seen, and Mark actually, I think maybe it was you, mentioned like $4,000 or $5,000 was what I saw in your chart for smugglers. We're actually seeing this go up to $10,000 and $11,000. Especially, we've seen this with our Guatemalan clients, and that is a massive burden that families cannot pay. They simply can't pay. We're seeing families losing their homes. They take this $10,000 loan, they put a mortgage on their house, or they offer, the mortgage on their house, and then they're having to give up homes once a child is back. So the tremendous stress and worry that a child has that they might be causing their family to lose a home, the family might lose a home. We have one family now that has like 30 people living in a house because they lost their home, and so they've gone to an extended family member. And also this level of debt creates a major risk of trafficking and of exploitive labor, because how on earth are you going to pay that, and who are you indebted to? There's one family, we found out about this child after he was already back in his community, and our partners reached out to the family to offer services, and the family said, no, it's too late. He's already working, and essentially he's in a completely exploitive situation, and all we can do is offer the services. But okay, so backing up, but I just wanted to connect the debt piece because I think it's so critical. Also, we see particular and unique needs of returning girls and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. The needs are different. If a returning girl, first of all, that we're seeing stigma, that even girls who have not been victimized, who have not been victimized, are sometimes assumed to have been victimized and are stigmatized in a way, right? Maybe they're sexually available, maybe they're, more at risk of being targeted because they're stigmatized. We've absolutely seen that. Pregnant and parenting girls have obviously also different needs. So we're seeing some specialized needs. I also would add to that in terms of development and economic opportunities, how to work with girls for options other than domestic labor, for example. Enrolling in school is a real significant challenge, especially for kids who've been gone for a long time. And, as our program has focused primarily in the Western Highlands of Guatemala, for children who are from remote communities, school might be very far away. For children from communities controlled by gangs, school might not be, or in schools that are in areas controlled by gangs, school might be a real challenge. So what are the possibilities for school? And then reintegrating into their families and community, again, particularly if they've been gone for a very long time. And this raises identity issues. We've really seen this with indigenous Guatemalan youth that we've worked with in our program, who, if they've been gone, in the U.S. for a year or 6 months, and some of them are staying in custody, for up to a year if they don't have a sponsor, and they're thinking they're going to fight out their case, and then they keep trying a couple different potential sponsors. It doesn't work, and they decide, even without a decision, they decide, I can't continue to be detained. So some of them, we're talking, though, long-term in custody. They've really learned a lot of Spanish, maybe, and are not as interested in speaking their indigenous native language. They're not as interested in the clothing, and have just had very different experiences. So identity issues as well. Finding and accessing, opportunities. And this is what is just also so critical. This being, as violence is certainly a significant part of this, and also, regardless of violence, in addition to violence, aside from violence, with this kind of debt, and with the limited school opportunities, and with, what are the opportunities that exist on return? The children, the families that they're from this affects all of them. Wait a second. Okay, there we go. So some of the lessons we've learned, I mentioned this about violence and the El Salvador, I already mentioned that program, and the inability of kids to access the services before they even remigrated. And especially of concern because we're working with some children repatriated from Mexico, where there's been less screening, where there's much less likely going to be access to counsel, where they're being turned around sometimes very quickly. I met a Honduran youth from the San Pedro Sula area when I was visiting Casa Alianza last year, and we were talking about starting to work together. And he had tried to migrate with 2 other brothers. One of the brothers made it. He and this other brother didn't make it. They were deported from Mexico. And a couple of the other brothers had been murdered before these 3 fled. So he was just in a situation where, he was hiding out at home. The threats had been renewed. There's no way this kid was going to be able to stay. And he was talking to me about, I'm making my plans, I'm ready to go back. So these kinds of examples, we can't send children, and I'm not just children, but I'm particularly talking about children. When you send folks back to situations of danger, it's not going to be viable for them to remain. I feel like that's a huge lesson that and it sounds obvious, but we're seeing it directly through these cases. Similarly, the best interest piece, not conducting best interest kind of assessments, or not even official determinations, but considering what's in a child's best interest before making decisions about what to do with them, which in every other context, in child welfare and all these other systems, we look at children's best interest. We don't do that in making decisions about removal or repatriation, we've been doing some research in Mexico in facilities, in I&M facilities, and in child welfare facilities with children, focused particularly on sexual and gender-based violence. But in those interviews, it has very clearly come up that we are looking at children who have tried numerous times from between the Guatemala and Mexico, borders. And so if they're going back to a situation which is really problematic, they're just going to turn around. The crushing debt piece, I hope someone here has ideas about that, because it's just, of real concern how to address that. We have definitely seen through our program, like I said, that when services are available and when children can be connected to education, job opportunities, mental health support, case management we really have seen to be very critical. And when those services are available, not just to the child who migrated, but to their siblings, and even more broadly in a way to their family, then everybody can benefit. So what you look at is actually reduced migration, not just of the children who've already attempted, but of their siblings who maybe haven't attempted. So just as an example, we have one client who went back to a very, very remote area of the Western Highlands of Guatemala last fall, I guess, and there were there was no school anywhere nearby. He wanted to be a carpenter. There were 0 opportunities to pursue any kind of carpentry, even in the as an apprentice or an internship, even in the capital of of the area that he was from. And so the program we worked with found a possibility for him somewhere else, and he went and stayed, basically, they set up a kind of living arrangement for him, and he went to school, and he was getting technical training and also an apprenticeship. And he's now at the end of the apprenticeship. He's about to go back to his community, and he's going to be able to work as a carpenter. His whole family is benefiting from that. And in other cases, we've had clients go back, and then a sibling will attend workshops that our partners will run, or our partners will help them also connect to schools and things like that. So that piece is very important. Also, we have found that the cost of reintegration in our small model, but that it's much lower than the cost of, let's say, custody and Office of Refugee Resettlement facilities, which, if I understand correctly, depending on the facility, is $300 to $500 a day. And the kids that are going back from custody are usually, ORR has an average of 30-day in custody before release, but the kids that are taking voluntary departure from ORR are usually there at least 3 months and sometimes 4 months. And if they're in a $500 a day facility, and like I mentioned, some of those kids are there because they didn't have a sponsor, and they're a year. We have had some clients who've been in custody for a year at the cost of. And these programs, our program, it really depends on how long a child is in it and exactly the services, but I would say we think it's about $2,000 a year. We've done it for less until now, but in really looking at it, we think it costs more like $2,000 a year, which is very, very, obviously looking very different. And this is something Yesenia mentioned, I think the real importance of involving governments, so Central American governments in reintegration, rather than having NGOs do all of this work. It's super important for NGOs to be partners with governments in this, but the governments have a really important role of looking at, these are our kids going back, or these are our families going back, and we have obligations to them, obligations to ensure their protection and for them to be able to enjoy their rights. And you have these really powerful partnerships when you bring civil society together with government. And I think also from what we've seen, when you're looking at international and community-based civil society organizations with government. Okay, and I think if there's more time, I'll say more, otherwise I'll wait for questions. Because I skipped a slide, is what I realized. Oh, there we go. That's okay. I think I said it, because I can't find the slide I'm looking for. It was just more specific on our services, but I think that's fine. We'll open up for questions. Natalie, do you want to come up here, or should I sit down?
So questions for Natalie or Lisa, and maybe we'll move around with the mics. 1, 2.
I have a question. Can you guys hear me? Okay. I have a question for Natalie. I'm a clinical psychologist and also do a lot of research with unaccompanied immigrant minors, specifically dealing with their mental health after they're here in the U.S. And a big challenge that I see is that there are very limited resources in the U.S. in general for evidence-based trauma care. I don't know, I don't have an exact statistic, but I would say more than 90% of people that do trauma care don't do evidence-based practice, aren't doing things that are consistent with science. And those that do, unfortunately, are often in private practice, are often in research groups at universities, and are inaccessible to people who don't have the right, don't meet the inclusion criteria for those studies, or don't have the finances to pay somebody who's in private practice. So I was wondering what you all are doing in terms of following through with recommendations for trauma-informed care. I don't have a solution. I make tons of recommendations for trauma-informed, evidence-based practice, individual therapy, and I don't know that any of my kids end up getting it. Do you mean recommendations after? Right, so after they leave your program, you were saying that that's a big part of it, is working with them individually to get those referrals. And I was wondering, are you finding those referrals? Are there people that speak Spanish doing evidence-based practice that you can refer to? And if so, how are they supposed to afford and access those services?
Right. Well, one, we're just starting, but two, it's individualized, so whether it's up to really what the women would like. And in a lot of times, speaking actually from our family case management program perspective, one thing that surprised me is that
a lot of times the women aren't even, and these are the ones that are in the community, so you're asking about the community, so I think I'm going to answer more from the family case management program, because those are the women in the cities already who were released from the centers. It's interesting to me that even though the program started in January, very few are actually wanting to go to clinical mental health providers yet. I think and in my experience in my other job too, I think there's a phase of needing normalizing their lives first and just stabilizing and just getting their children's needs met and being able to be at a point where they even want to talk about trauma. And I think that is a lot of what our focus is in the trauma-informed care program perspective, is to really take it from a baby step and wanting them to be comfortable and feel empowered and have coping skills to be able to go through what they're going through. So short answer is we're not even there yet where there's a big demand and need for it. But I totally agree with you that there's just not a lot of resources out there. Honestly, you probably know more than I do about what is evidence-based, what's not. I mean, that's a lot of why we have our working group to help us to advise us on that. It's just, it is what it is, you know, in our country, honestly, with the capacity, with that specific services, I think, yeah.
I have a question for Lisa, and I'm wondering if you've interacted at all with the CAM program and have found that to be either addressing or not addressing some of the challenges that you discussed.
So we have a small project with pro bono lawyers in El Salvador and in Honduras representing is the wrong word because there's no official role for counsel in CAM, supporting children in the CAM process. It's a small number of children, but we've worked on with like 35 cases. So am I seeing that address which challenges, address the violence, address? So CAM is, I think, and the expansion will be a really good thing because it's bringing in more people. CAM, I think, is a really important opportunity that, you know, we've seen 95, I guess the numbers is where and I'm not a super number person, but 9,500 applications versus how many unaccompanied kids have come. So I am totally in support of CAM, but it's not an either or, in our strong opinion. My personal, and I know Kyne's, is, you know, it doesn't address the full need by any stretch. It does provide an important vehicle, and I've seen both children who have individually been in true danger be able to come through CAM, and children who have not themselves been in danger but are living in a community where they could be a danger at some point. They likely will be in danger, you know, at some point in the future. So it is, and it's providing a family reunification mechanism, and it's providing, you know, what is happening though, because of the length of time it takes to process the CAM applications, and we're looking at about 400 days. I think these are taking around, it's definitely more than a year, but around 400 days was, I believe, what PRM told us in a recent meeting, that for kids who are in true danger, we have seen some have to flee during the process and not be able to wait out the process, and that's a real shame, right? Is there's the and the protection transfer agreement in Costa Rica will be able to take some of them in, but only if they're actually true. They can't take unaccompanied kids, so they can take children who are under care of an adult family member but they're not gonna be able to take unaccompanied kids. So that's also a concern. And then the other thing is the newer, you know, I don't even have a name for it, but the newer resettlement, not CAM, the other refugee resettlement. Yeah, but I don't know. I don't have the other refugee resettlement Central America program that was announced in July is, you know, going to thus far. And I know, you know, the DHS and the administration, and I mean, are totally in support of it being bigger, and I believe PRM is too. So that's very positive, but it is starting out, you know, very slowly for reasons that make sense. Costa Rica is concerned, you know, we need to see that this will work, but it's starting out with about 200 individuals at a time. So I think that's really important because it's another opportunity, and this will really focus on folks in grave and immediate danger. But again, looking at the numbers, so that's why I think it's not an either or, it's an additional, you know, and also can we ramp up this additional refugee resettlement, which is right now only actually in El Salvador, though the goal is to get it to Honduras and Guatemala. I have a super quick, I realized what I forgot to say. Just one thing, which is a little point, but really, really important. We have seen through the reintegration work that there's critical, importance also in connecting up reintegration services to development. Because, if there's lack of opportunities, it's just, so, and, the 750 million that was mentioned, which is focusing certainly in part on creation of jobs, but is it going to be creation of jobs both in rural and urban areas? Is there going to be focus on youth and needs of youth in the labor force? Is there going to be focus on creating jobs for girls outside of traditional spheres? And so those are some real pieces that we feel like are critically important generally, and also connected up to reintegration. And I know my personal hope in a future iteration of KIND's reintegration work, and or anybody else that joins in the reintegration, hopefully we can really look at creating much bigger alliances, would be to bring in economic development experts to work very closely together on this.
Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. So I'm going to make a few quick announcements before we break for lunch, and then I'm going to ask Rachel to come in and tell us about lunch. So this concludes the presentations section of day one. We've heard 6 presentations, 3 of them in area 1, strategies to prevent unauthorized flows of people, challenges and opportunities, and 3 of them in area 2 or theme 2, rethinking the removal repatriation process, examining approaches that balance removal procedures, reintegration into countries of origin, and family integrity in the U.S. So what we're going to do when we come from lunch after 2 is that we're going to break into 2 small groups. At the end of this hallway are the 2 rooms that we're going to be using. Plaza 3 is on your left and Plaza 4 is on your right. So the folks who signed up for or are interested in attending the first theme, strategies to prevent unauthorized flow, will go to Plaza 3, so on your left as you approach the end of the hallway. And folks who chose to or are interested in the rethinking removal and repatriation process will be in Plaza 4, which are on your right. And the rooms are clearly labeled. And then we're going to spend the afternoon together, kind of having a rich conversation about what we've heard and bringing your experiences. The presenters will be in the rooms where that are aligned with their presentations. We will have a facilitator in each room. The Area 1 strategies to prevent will be Dr. Venta. Want to identify yourself, stand up, say hello. Colleague from Sam Houston State College. And the facilitator for Area 2 or Theme 2, Rethinking Removal and Repatriation, is Lisa, whom you've just heard from. And they will be assisted by 2 people taking notes. We want to really have the facilitators focus on ensuring the flow of the work, and there will be 2 people assisting to make sure that we capture the richness of the discussion. And we'll be doing that all afternoon. There'll be a break somewhere in between, so the facilitators will keep track of that. And then when we break for for the day, in terms of the work of the afternoon, we'll all resume back here at 5 o'clock. We're going to come back into this room at 5, and each group will do a brief presentation of their discussions. And then we're going to have a social event while we set up for dinner and for the screening of a film by Luis Argueta and a presentation by him. So we're very excited to have Luis here and to learn about this trilogy that he's been working on. He's now working on the 3rd film, which is almost complete. So the federal partners, remember that there are outside 2 stations for you to pay for lunch with cash or credit. Parking, if you have any questions about parking or anything else, Rachel is our logistics guru, and she's going to tell us about lunch.
Hello. First of all, wanted to let you know if you are a federal employee and you haven't made arrangements to pay, you actually pay tomorrow morning, either credit card or cash or check. The person who was taking that had to go back to U of H campus. So she'll be back here in the morning for anyone who needs to kind of settle that. Also, lunch is going to be downstairs in Justin's. If you go out to the express elevator, you go down to the concourse level, which is the level right below the lobby. And Justin's is basically right around the corner from
where you land in the elevator. If you want to go to your rooms first and then go down, same thing. Those elevators also go down to the concourse level. And I think they open up on like the area by the ballroom, but Justin's is also just right there. If you have any questions, let me know. If you have any questions about parking or anything else, you know, I'll try to help you guys out.
And we'll resume at 2 p.m. up here. Thank you for the morning, and thanks to our AV team.